A quick like and subscribe really helps our channel grow and allows us to bring you even more amazing content. Thank you for your support.
I've always tried to be a good parent, or at least, that's what I tell myself when the guilt creeps in, especially after the argument with my son, Noah, last weekend. It started innocently enough. We were hosting a family barbecue, the kind that used to be full of laughter and joy, but things changed when his cousin, Mia, came over. Mia, with her bright smile, effortless charm, and an ease with people that Noah has never quite managed to grasp, was a whirlwind of energy as she sauntered into our yard after a long drive from the city. Noah, my 10-year-old introvert, sat rigidly at the corner of our deck, poking at his plate of burgers like they had personally offended him. When Mia launched herself at her younger sister, Chloe, squealing with delight and engaging her with an uninhibited joy that only kids should possess, I couldn't help but notice Noah's sulking expression grow darker. The longer he watched Mia laugh and play, the more withdrawn he became. It was as if every giggle was a dagger buried deeper into his heart, and the way my daughter fawned over Mia cut like shards of broken glass. I couldn't ignore it. When the barbecue came to a close, and I noticed Mia stuffing her face with cake while Noah stared blankly into his soda, I felt a pang of frustration bubbling up within me, a vile mix of heartbreak and anger that begged to be unleashed. So, I did what I shouldn't have. I confronted him. "You know, it's your fault she's happier to see Mia than she is to see you," I blurted out, the words laced with a sting I instantly regretted. Noah's face fell, his eyes wide with a combination of hurt and confusion, like a kid who'd just been told there's no Santa. He looked at me with a depth of sadness I had never seen before, and in that moment, I realized I had crossed a line, but it was too late to take it back. I watched him wilt under the weight of my words, and my heart twisted painfully as I heard Mia exclaim how much she missed Chloe, how they should have playdates all summer long, as Noah quietly snuck away from the group, headed inside like a ghost. The rest of the day was a haze. Laughter echoed outside while I stared at my untouched food as guilt coiled around my insides. It felt like the summer buzz had died with my son's spirit, and I couldn't bear to face the implications of what I had done. I watched Noah pace the floor of our living room, his brows knitted in concentration as if he were solving an unsolvable puzzle. I knew I'd hurt him but couldn't shake the feeling that maybe, just maybe, my harsh words were a push he needed to confront his own struggles with social interactions. Parenting is a turbulent sea. Sometimes, you have to risk capsizing in order to teach your child how to swim. But that little thought didn't diminish the weight pressing down on me, a hand squeezing painfully around my heart while I tried justifying my big mouth. I spent the night tossing and turning, his shocked face replaying in my mind, a haunting echo of regret that morphed into nightmares filled with shadows whispering secrets of my failures. By morning, I decided I needed to talk to him, get his side of the story, and construct a bridge over this chasm I had opened with careless words. I found him in his room, so small and fragile in the dim, gray sunlight filtering through his window. When I sat beside him, he looked up, eyes stormy with a mixture of sorrow and anger. I wanted to reach out and pull him into my embrace, but something kept me rooted in place, the ghost of my previous words acting as a barrier. "Mom, why did you say that?" he asked, his voice steady but breaking at the edges. I fumbled for the right words but found none. "I didn't mean, I just wanted you to see." But stopped, trailing off, feeling the futility of my attempts. "Are you mad at me?" he said, and that broke me. I felt the hot rush of tears stinging my eyes as I wrestled with an instinct to just sweep him up and yell at him to express himself, let anger out into the ether rather than bottle it up like he always does. Noah was my delicate boy, always so kind but often mocked at school for being too soft. How could I say anything, be anything, when all I wanted was to shelter him from the world? "You're not to blame for anything, Mia is just more outgoing, and it shouldn't matter," I replied weakly, desperately clawing for some reassurance in my own voice while he stared at me, waiting for real honesty. I wanted to tell him that I was scared of his loneliness, scared that he wouldn't fit into the world the way I hoped for him, that every snide remark from his peers killed a piece of my heart. "You know what, Mom? I just want to be me," came those fragile words, breaking through the air, and in that moment, I realized how wrong I had been. As he turned away and stared out the window, I was reminded of crisp autumn days, golden leaves spiraling silently to the earth, and suddenly I felt the weight of my own expectations crashing down like thunder. I'd wanted my son to be someone he's not. The thought lingered long after he left to find solace in his video games, an echo of realization that resonated deep within me. It wasn't Noah who needed to change, it was me that needed to stop placing blame and start nurturing the incredible person he was destined to become. I knew I had to repair the rift I had caused, but how? Days passed, and I crafted a plan, an emotional lifeline, something to counter the agony of that summer gathering. I realized that he needed not just an apology but a show of faith in his individuality. A camping trip, just the two of us, away from the chaos, was something he could take pride in. So I took him one Saturday, packed the car with sleeping bags and junk food, and we left our technology behind, just the two of us, under the vast canopy of stars. I watched as Noah pitched the tent, his confidence growing little by little with each step he took, and I felt something shift in the air. The weight of guilt was still there but backed by hope too. As we sat around the campfire, with the crackling flames dancing in our eyes, I told him everything, how proud I was of him, how much his uniqueness meant to me, how I should have encouraged him to be himself rather than lash out in frustration. His grin lit up the night, warming the chill away like the flames before us, and in that magic moment, I saw a spark of resilience flicker in his soul. I realized something immensely powerful. By letting him feel just a bit of the weight of the world, he took the first step towards overcoming it. A few weeks later, things had transformed slightly. Noah laughed louder, started to engage with new friends from school, and I couldn't help but feel a deep sense of relief. It was as if my awful comments had forced a metamorphosis instead of breaking him, and as I watched him go through that new cycle of life, I knew I'd been wrong but that sometimes wrong turns can lead to unexpected growth. The barbecue wasn't the last. Family gatherings still echoed laughter just like that day did, but now I watched my son thrive instead of falter, and the cycle of hurt had turned into a cycle of healing, teaching him the resilience of the human spirit and that no matter what happens, coming back stronger is what truly matters. Amidst all that drama, amidst those blurted words and tearful evenings, there had emerged a tender understanding that formed deeper than any barrier, and while I may have blamed Noah, I realized it was just the gentle nudges of parenthood that pushed us both to be better versions of ourselves. In hauntingly beautiful ways, sometimes insensitivity can lead us to the love we really need. I never considered myself a bad friend, but the day I snapped at Jenna, my pregnant best friend, turned my life upside down. It started innocently enough. Jenna was over for the fourth time that week, her foot swollen like a cantaloupe, her back aching from all the weight she was carrying, and to be fair, the complaints were unending. Each time she plopped down on the couch, it was like an exorcism of woes, the nausea, the cravings that went unfulfilled, and her desperate need for a foot rub. I could empathize. Pregnancy was undoubtedly hard, but each session felt like I was hearing the same horror story on repeat. By the time she showed up on that fateful Friday evening, I was exhausted from a week of late shifts and even later coffee. As she sank into her supportive pillows, I braced myself for another round of grievances, and that's when it happened. "I just want one day where I don't feel like a beached whale," she lamented, and something inside me snapped. It wasn't even the comment itself, but the way her eyes glazed over as she spoke, like she was on autopilot, repeating the same verses in a never-ending song of misery. I'd had it. I turned to her, feeling my chest tightening with frustration, and said, "Jenna, I can't stand your complaining anymore. You're pregnant, yes, but you have to find joy in this somewhere, right? I get that it's hard, but damn it, other people have it worse than you." The words hung in the air, heavy and toxic. The laughter we had shared moments before died, her smile fading into a tight line, and silence enveloped the room like a cold blanket. I thought she'd laugh it off or throw a pillow at me, but instead, she just stared. Her reaction was haunting, her disappointment scalding, and for the first time, I sensed a dark shadow looming over our friendship. She muttered something that got lost in the tension before getting up and leaving, the sound of the door clicking shut echoing like a gunshot. At first, guilt gnawed at me. Had I been heartless? But then came ask you comfort, a whisper in my ear that maybe my words held some truth. The next day, a part of me expected her to text, to berate me or demand an apology, but nothing came. Days turned into a week, and I could feel the silence stretching like a taut string, almost ready to snap. When I did reach out, she'd answer but with the stiffness of a stranger. What hurt most were the glimpses of social media. I could see her struggles, the photos of swelling feet, cradling hands, but none of it felt real anymore. It was like watching a staged production where I had been written out of existence. Part of me felt relieved, thinking this space would allow her to regroup, but deep down, dread nagged at my core. Then, on a particularly lonely evening, just as I was about to drown myself in Netflix and Ben & Jerry's, a text from her lit my screen. "Can we talk?" My pulse quickened. I felt sick but also exhilarated. I agreed and mentally prepared for the storm. She arrived, and I noted the weariness etched on her face, shadows under her eyes that hadn't been there before. "I've been thinking," she started, voice wavering. "About what you said." Panic prickled my spine, but she continued. "I've tried to conceal my struggle because everyone tells me I should be joyful, I should be glowing, but I'm not. I'm drowning, and I thought you, of all people, would understand." I opened my mouth to apologize, realizing she wasn't just pleading for sympathy, but begging for a lifeline. I could see it now, all of it, the internal battle she fought, the guilt of not experiencing the serene bliss of motherhood while others sang its praises. But as I awkwardly fumbled with my words, it was clear all that came out was a mix of trembling apologies and half-hearted reassurances. I wanted to lift her burden, but the weight was too much for both of us, and just when I felt like we might connect, she dropped a bomb. "I had a dream about you, you know. Last night." Darkness washed over her expression, twisting reality into something grotesque, and my heart sank as she recounted a visceral dream of a shadow that had pulled her into a hall of crooked mirrors, and there, in every reflection, I stood, grinning, unfeeling, as she writhed beneath the surface. My skin prickled. "It felt so real, Jen. Like you were watching me suffer, and you didn't care." The moonlight pooled through her window as her voice softened. "You became the thing that haunted me." I tried to explain how I was just worn out too, but looked into her eyes and froze. I saw desperation, yes, but lurking beneath was something darker, something that felt like loss more than just disappointment. Then I felt a shift in the atmosphere, a weight in the air that made my breath catch. Something was coming. The power flickered then dimmed, leaving us awash in darkness, and I glanced around, heart racing as I felt it, a presence at the edge of the room, chilling and heavy, wrapping itself around our fears. "Jenna," I whispered, panic creeping back into my voice, but before I could even turn back to her, I felt an icy grip on my wrist. The last thing I saw before the shadows overwhelmed us was Jenna's eyes, wide and terrified, no longer filled with sorrow but pure dread, as she mouthed a word, "Help." It was in that moment, amidst a palpable darkness, I realized that my inadvertent cruelty had unleashed something far more menacing than either of us could comprehend, and as the darkness closed in, I understood, we weren't just fighting between us, we were wrestling with the very horrors we had conjured, each complaint, each thought twisting into the shadows waiting to consume us whole. Last year, when my wife and I were expecting our daughter, we picked a beautiful name, Lila. It was a name that flowed like a gentle breeze, filled with warmth and kindness. Yet, shortly after her birth, something terrifying happened that turned our lives inside out and left me questioning my own sanity. It was a typical night. Lila had just been put down, and the house was quiet, the kind of quiet that wraps around you and feels almost sacred. That's when I heard it, a soft whispering coming from the nursery. At first, I thought it was just the wind, or perhaps the creaks of an old house settling into the chilling night. But as I listened more closely, I distinctly heard someone call her name, Lila. I froze, my blood turning to ice. I quietly crept to the door and peered through the small crack. There was no one in there, just the crib, the soft mobile spinning lazily above, and Lila, sleeping soundly, blissfully unaware of the sinister shadow that had seeped into our home. Thankfully, she was fine, but I couldn't shake the feeling of unease, like we'd crossed into a realm we weren't supposed to. Over the next few weeks, the haunting whispers continued, and weird things began happening. Once, I swear I saw the outline of a child's handprint on the nursery window, even though I hadn't let anyone near the house. Every time I brought it up to my wife, she shrugged it off as postpartum nerves, urging me to seek help. But it wasn't my sanity that I questioned, these were real manifestations, something darker than our mundane life. It got even stranger when one night, I awoke to Lila's cries echoing through the house. Rushing into the room, I found her wide-eyed, fixated on the corner of the room, her tiny finger pointed at something invisible. I panicked and scooped her up, trembling as I felt the weight of whatever unseen presence loomed near us. I knew I had to do something. I became obsessed, scouring the internet for anything that could explain this phenomenon. That's when I stumbled upon countless forums, each filled with heart-wrenching stories of children who seemed to have a connection to the ethereal realm, many accompanied by bizarre, folklore-inspired names. Suddenly, it all clicked. The name Lila derived from ancient roots and was tied to an old lore I could scarcely comprehend, a name said to call forth spirits from beyond, suggesting that perhaps my daughter was more than just my little girl, she could be a vessel for something unfathomable. With each ghostly whisper that echoed through the walls, the urgency of change became palpable. I approached my wife with what I'd learned, fearful and desperate. I suggested we consider changing Lila's name, perhaps to something less steeped in mystery and darkness, something that could sever any ties to the unsettling occurrences that now surrounded her. But she was vehemently opposed, her heart set on the name that laced our daughter's identity with beauty. "You can't just change it because you're scared of shadows," she yelled, her voice laced with anger and disbelief. "What kind of parent would do that? You're being irrational." In that moment, a chasm formed between us, split by fear and misunderstanding. Our relationship began to unravel, arguing over what felt like life or death to me became the new normal, my wife seeing me not as a caring father but as a paranoid lunatic. And then the horrors escalated. One evening, as I sat watching a movie with the sound turned low, I became acutely aware of Lila's cries rising like a siren in the night. I moved instinctively, racing to her room and coming to an abrupt stop at the threshold. The room was cast in shadows, but I swear I saw a figure hovering at Lila's crib, its dark form shrouded in an unsettling aura. I bolted forward, the adrenaline sending my heart into a frenzy, but as I grasped Lila in my arms, the figure dissipated, leaving nothing but the haunting feeling of being watched, as if time slowed and reality warped around me. That night, I couldn't sleep. I was convinced that Lila was in danger, and if I didn't act soon, something irreparable would happen. Frustrated and alone, I began calling her by different names in the hopes of masking the darkness lurking just beyond our world: Rose, Lily, even Daisy. My daughter, thank God, seemed content, cooing and gurgling in response, but my wife grew furious, hurling insults when I refused to use her chosen name. "You're making a mockery of our daughter," she screamed at me, tears spilling down her cheeks. "She deserves better than a father who's too scared to face his own demons." Each confrontation felt like nails on a chalkboard, deepening the rift, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I was trying to keep Lila safe. But then it happened. One night, as I lay beside her on the bed, I awoke suddenly, drenched in sweat, a weight bearing down on my chest. I turned to check on her. Lila was gone. The nursery door stood ajar, and dread consumed me. I quickly bolted upright, racing through the dark corridors until I found her. She wasn't in her room. I searched the house, a panic setting in, with every shadow feeling alive. Just as I was about to scream her name, I heard a giggle from behind the living room curtain. I yanked it aside, and there she was, standing and staring at what seemed to be a swirling mass of darkness in the corner of the room. "Lila," I croaked, but she didn't respond. Instead, her hands stretched out toward the void, my heart shattering as the whispers grew louder, mingling with her innocent laughter. "I'm sorry," I cried, feeling every ounce of regret spill from my mouth. "We can change it. We can change your name." But the moment felt futile, as if I were shouting into a void that would consume me whole. My daughter took a step forward, and as if the very essence of the thing she faced reached out, I saw her eyes turn dark, swallowed up by a vortex I couldn't see but felt deep in my bones. Just before all resonance was lost, I lunged, snatching her up and stumbling back, my heart racing as the air around us crackled with energy. In that split second, I understood, whatever was trying to pull her in wanted her. It wanted her because of her name. Without a second thought, I screamed, "Your name isn't Lila anymore. It's Rose." The air shifted with a chilling breeze, and the darkness in the room suddenly flickered, as if contemplating its grip. I grasped her tighter, expecting every spine-tingling whisper to break me down, but it withdrew, and Lila blinked up at me, eyes wide, as if she hadn't even registered the chaos around her. I took that moment to flee, racing to my wife, who stood paralyzed in the doorway, horror etched upon her face. "We need to change her name, we need to save her," I yelled, my voice frantic, but as I spoke, I saw the realization darken my wife's eyes. I was no longer the doting father, I had become the enemy. "You've gone too far," she screamed, thrusting one hand at me, the other clutching Lila tightly. "I will never forgive you for this." And then it all crashed down. My family and I were caught in an unending battle, one I never wanted. I was left with two choices: protect my daughter from an unseen force hell-bent on claiming her soul, or face a new terror, losing the only family I ever wanted because I dared to act on a fear that was dehumanizing my love. So here I am, battling between love and fear, asking everyone if I'm the asshole for refusing to change my daughter's name. But how do you explain there's something darker lurking just beyond the veil of understanding? Something that whispers when the wind blows, waiting for weakness to snatch away the light. Would you change something innocent to preserve what you love? Is it easier to accept loss than to fight through shadows? I wonder if I might lose them both, my Lila and the warmth of my wife, so I ask you, AITA? When my grandmother passed away, she left us with a trove of jewelry, each piece laden with memories and whispers of family history woven into their ornate designs, and it was decided at her funeral that her prized possessions would go to her favorite, my cousin Sarah, who had always been vocal about her longing for them. I was more of a quiet observer in our family dynamics, something of an underdog constantly overlooked, so when the time came to talk about the inheritance, I stood back, allowing the others to discuss Sarah's claims, her tears, as they painted a picture of the deserving child, the granddaughter her heart favored. But not long after, I couldn't shake the feeling that there was something more sinister lurking beneath the surface, a gnawing sensation that my grandmother would not have wanted to make that decision so neatly or so soon without considering the rest of us. I started looking at the jewelry the night after the funeral, each one glimmering under the soft light of the lamp, but it wasn't the sparkle that drew me in, it was the way they seemed to pulse with a life of their own, almost as if revealing stories only I could hear. The emerald pendant, my grandmother always said, held the spirit of protection, the silver bracelet twinkled with memories of laughter and mourning, and the pearl earrings, her most cherished, echoed the vows she took, binding family together. As the days passed, I sneaked out with the jewelry one evening to my grandmother's house, the winds howling against the glass like voices pleading, wearing a heavy weight of unease as I unlocked the door to her empty living room, the barren space feeling far too strange without her tender presence. I laid the items out on the table, compelled to remember each story, but as I did, the air turned thick, heavy with an electrifying tension that set my skin prickling. I whispered my grandmother's name, a desperate plea for wisdom, and suddenly I felt it, an icy breath against my neck, a presence so real that I spun around expecting to find someone, but there was only the whisper of moths tapping ineffectively against the windows. That night, sleep evaded me as I wrestled with visions of Sarah, her face twisted with disappointment should I fail to return the jewelry, yet my heart shuddered with the instinct that something wasn't right. Then came the nightmares. In them, my grandmother appeared, her ethereal face hovering above me, her lips chanted a warning I couldn't decipher, yet the urgency behind her eyes pierced through the fog of sleep. Each night, those dreams grew darker. I saw Sarah in the attic, rifling through boxes, her hands clawing at the memories I wanted to preserve. I felt a rush of anger, a need to step in, despite everyone else dismissing me as jealous or bitter, yet I was only following my grandmother's wishes. Days melted into each other, and I found myself ensnared in the tension of relatives crowded in my small living room, each eager to claim their share, everyone casting furtive glances in my direction, waiting for me to hand over what my grandmother had apparently promised to Sarah. I held my ground, aware that Sarah's eyes glinted in the reminder of friendship, tangled with loss, hers for my grandmother, and mine for the identities we were expected to wield as family members. As the pressure mounted, so too did the whispers. Rumors spread through the family like wildfire, accusations of greed unfurling over dinner tables, bitterness painting a rift between us. I considered surrendering the jewelry just to appease the storm of hurt feelings, yet around the same time, the jewelry began haunting me in ways I could not explain, strange occurrences swirling within the confines of the house, the lights flickering, objects rearranging themselves in the darkness, and echoes of laughter that seemed to originate from the pieces themselves. I couldn't help but wonder, did my grandmother bestow her earthly treasures with the intention of continuing a cycle, or did she craft them with the precision to repel tormentors like Sarah? Then came the revelation one stormy night when I sat in silence, the rain beating against the windows like a relentless drum. That was when I discovered the hidden compartment in the emerald pendant, the chill of the metal pricking at my fingertips as I worked to open it, revealing an old photograph of my grandmother in a flowing dress and a note, its edges frayed, penned with her delicate script, warning to keep the jewelry close, the ones who covet them may have intentions that corrupt. The moment I clutched that slip of paper, a warmth flooded through me, threads of connection stretching back through generations. The intent warned me away from surrendering the legacy she left behind. The next day, I finally approached Sarah, the sunlight splintering through dark clouds, making the moment feel almost surreal. I placed my hands on the table, grounding myself as I looked into my cousin's eyes, shimmering with tears and expectancy, and I told her how our grandmother would never have wanted this kind of animosity and entitlement stemming from love. Those gems were mine, bound through blood and shared history. The room fell silent, the tension sharper than any blade. I could see the reflection of other relatives in Sarah's pupils flip-flopping between support and a need for dissension, but something snapped inside me, and a fierce voice broke through, claiming our shared bond that had long been overshadowed by greed. Time froze momentarily, and to my shock, Sarah's expression shifted. Betrayal twisted her features, but then I noticed the shadows behind her, creeping along the edges of the room, a darkness that felt familiar and foreboding. It dawned upon me that I was not the only one who had heard my grandmother's pleas. The air thickened with disquiet as it dawned on me. I wasn't just defending some jewels, I was shielding our bloodline. Clutching the pendant close to my heart, I vowed to keep the jewelry not as a mere possession but as a guardian of stories that could not be tainted by envy or desire. I realized now that sometimes protecting a legacy meant making hard choices, forcing your hand against those you love, becoming the villain in their eyes to uphold the dignity of those departed. As the shadows receded slowly, I felt it, a quiet resolve wrapping an iron grip around my heart, knowing I was not wrong for resisting Sarah's claim but rather, I was right to protect what was more sacred than envy, our family. In that moment, the chains of our ancestral stories tightened like a noose, both a blessing and a curse, binding me to a fate I would uphold, in memory of her, against all odds, even if it meant sealing the very fate of our family. I never thought my wedding would end in chaos, but when my cousin Lisa showed up in a blood-red gown that clashed with the white theme of my ceremony, it felt like I'd walked into a horror movie instead of my dream day. I had been preparing for this moment for months, pouring my heart and soul into every detail, from the flowers to the music, all meticulously designed to evoke the purest enchantment. While I floated down the aisle in the lace gown I had envisioned since childhood, the embodiment of everything I had ever wanted. I remember the moment I spotted Lisa, standing smugly in the doorway of the venue with that gaudy dress that mirrored the sinister beauty of a vampire in some cheap film. I felt the air chill around me, my stomach twisting with a mixture of disbelief and anger. Didn't she know this day wasn't about her? The whispers of my friends buzzed in my ears, murmurs of disdain that fed my fury as I approached her, my carefully cultivated smile now plastered on my face like a mask. "Lisa, why are you here?" I asked, struggling to keep my voice steady, knowing the photographer was capturing every moment. "I thought it'd be a nice surprise," she replied, her tone dripping with faux innocence. At that moment, I remembered every family gathering where Lisa had overshadowed me, every snide comment she had made that belittled my choices, and I resolved that today would be different. My heart raced as I glanced back at my fiancé, who had excused himself to handle a family emergency but had assured me moments before that he couldn't wait to see me in my dress. Deep down, I didn't want to cause a scene, but her presence felt threatening, malignant, like she was festering in the happy blooms of this day, ready to checkmate me. As I took a step closer, Lisa's eyes flashed with that familiar defiance that prickled the nape of my neck. "What's your issue?" "It's just a color," she responded, feigning ignorance, but the challenge in her voice stoked the fire brewing inside me. "It's not just a color, it's a wedding." I shot back, my fury bubbling to the surface as I wrestled with the decision weighing on my conscience. A part of me was screaming to turn back, to let it slide and just enjoy the day, but another part clung to the bubbling rage, a sense of justice that demanded action. "Leave. Now," I spat, my fingers trembling as I clenched them into fists. The guests' eyes locked onto us, an audience drawn into an unfolding drama that felt vividly alive as whispers rippled through the crowd, but rather than fear, I felt a surge of adrenaline at reclaiming my day, my moment. Lisa's facade cracked, anger bubbling up beneath her flawless skin as she opened her mouth to retort, but all I could think about was how tired I was of being walked over, tired of being the unobtrusive cousin, the forever witness to her eclipses, tired of everything that had been unsaid over the years. "You're making a mistake. This is ridiculous. You're ruining your own wedding. Over something so petty," she shouted, her voice cutting through the whispers, drawing me closer to confrontation. I could see the shock on the faces of a few of my aunts, the mixture of gasps and raised eyebrows filling the room with anticipation, but I had crossed the threshold, I couldn't stop now. With every ounce of resolve I could muster, I turned my back on her, striding toward the wedding coordinator, whose eyes widened in disbelief and then mirrored my determination. "Security, please," I commanded, my heart drumming like a war cry as I heard Lisa hiss behind me, the noise echoing with the venom of a snake cornered, but I pressed on. I knew what having her there meant. It wasn't just about the dress, it was about the years of her putting me in the shadows. Moments later, two burly men approached, their expressions neutral yet ready, and when they were instructed to escort Lisa out, the look of hurt and fury painted her face as she went limp, her shock overwhelming her defiance. "You'll regret this," she spat as she was guided out, each word a dart aimed at my heart. As I stood there, shaking but finally feeling light, the burden of her specter lifted from my shoulders, the weight of my family's toxicity unfurling in the dust behind her. The ceremony resumed, but I could feel the eyes of my relatives boring into my back, the murmurs of disapproval hanging in the air thick as fog, and I couldn't tell if they were aggrieved by my actions or secretly relieved to be rid of the drama Lisa seemed to constantly bring. My heart sank as I realized what I'd done. The moment of triumph had morphed into a shadow of regret, the whispers of bridezilla and family tension stirring uncontrollably around me like a whirlwind of judgmental stares. As the vows were exchanged and I glanced around, I couldn't shake the feeling that Lisa wouldn't take this lightly, especially with her threatening words hanging heavy in the air. After the ceremony, as the reception blossomed around me in joyful chaos, laughter, dancing, and so many smiles, my joy felt marred by the creeping shadow of guilt. Could I really celebrate a day that, in some way, felt marred by the act of banishment? I tried to brush away the thoughts, focusing instead on the love swelling in my chest for my husband and the genuine moments shared with our friends, but Lisa's presence loomed heavily in my mind like a specter waiting to strike. Days turned into weeks, and just as I thought I could forget about the wedding drama, my phone buzzed late one night, draining the color from my face. It was a group text from my family. My heart raced as I opened it to find a picture of Lisa in that hideous, blood-red gown, with the caption, "Some weddings should be cancelled." My stomach dropped like a stone as her slander spread through our family like wildfire. The rising tide of animosity was making its way toward me, wrapping around my throat, threatening to suffocate the joy I had fought for. Each Sunday dinner became an arena of cold silence, excluding me from family conversations as I was framed as the villain, and while I was initially defensive, the weight of isolation left me gasping. The day finally came when I was invited to a family gathering with an air of dread. As I stepped through the front door, I could practically feel the judgment dripping from the ceiling fixtures. I quietly made my way to the living room, my heart thundering loudly against my ribcage as I caught sight of Lisa, clad in white this time, sitting smugly at the center of the table like some dark queen surveying her territory. The tension gripped me like an iron fist, clenching my heart as unwelcome memories spiraled back. Her smirk twisted with cruelty was overwhelming, laying bare the extent of her hunger for vengeance. I stood frozen in place, contemplating my next move when Lisa's eyes met mine with a glint of sadistic glee, as if she had been waiting for this very moment. "Oh look, the bride graces us with her presence. Didn't you know weddings are supposed to be about everyone?" she quipped, laughter bubbling around her like a toxic potion, and just like that, the room shifted, murmurs erupting anew as I felt their eyes darting with interest between us. Her words were daggers, driving my insecurities deeper, igniting an inferno of rage within me, but instead of striking back as I longed to, all I could muster was a weak smile. "I'm glad to see you, too, Lisa," I managed to reply, forcing the words to escape, every syllable leaving a bitter taste in my mouth while her laughter washed over me like a tide, depending on the whispers of my family to feed her power. As the evening wore on, I noticed that my cousin didn't relent, sowing discord with poisoned words, planting unease in the hearts of my loved ones that grew more potent with every sip of wine. When I left that night, I felt the confines of my own family closing in, shadows whispering ever so softly, was I really the villain? But the truth was, standing at the edge of that wedding day, I had fought for myself in a world that always sidelined me, and even if the consequences were grave, I couldn't say I didn't deserve my moment of victory, however fleeting. So, AITA for having my cousin thrown out of my wedding? I don't know yet, but as I drive away, the question trembles in my mind: what kind of family comes together by building their foundation on the bones of betrayal? Last week, I found myself at the crossroads of familial loyalty and gut instinct, torn apart by my father's health issues and the shadow that loomed over his friend Walter, a man who'd slithered into our lives with charm and an unsettling undertone. My father, once vibrant and full of life, had been grappling with aggressive cancer for the past year, and despite the slowly thickening fog of despair that shrouded our home, Walter had introduced himself as a source of comfort under the guise of a devoted ally. I didn't think much of it at first. He showed up with handfuls of flowers, extravagant presents, and what seemed like genuine concern for my father's well-being. Every week, he called to check in, send uplifting messages, and even accompanied my dad to the very first round of treatments. But it wasn't long before I began noticing the little things, the way Walter would linger too long on the fringes of conversations, the crinkle in his smile whenever Dad mentioned me or my accomplishments, a creeping envy that spewed from his otherwise polished demeanor. The essence of his being wrapped itself around my father like an invasive vine, smothering his spirit while nurturing the insatiable thirst for control that lurked behind Walter's friendly facade. So when I found out that Walter had made plans to accompany my dad to his crucial 6-month checkup, a kind of distorted appointment that could either bring a glimmer of hope or the plunge into eternal darkness, my heart clenched tightly in rebellion. I dreaded the idea of relinquishing my protective post, of handing over my father's fragile trust to this man who felt more like a predator than a friend. I consulted my mother, who had been distant and quiet since Dad's diagnosis, and her silence spoke volumes. It was a low-grade anxiety that bubbled just under the surface, a synchronous heartbeat with my own buried fears. That night, I caved into the entangling dread and called the office, leaving a message, insisting that only I would accompany Dad to his appointment. The relief coursing through my veins was short-lived. When the day finally came, I met Walter standing at the front door, a smug smile plastered across his face, as if he had anticipated my next move. My father, clad in one of his favorite flannel shirts, looked caught between confusion and disappointment, but I latched onto his gaze, conveying a silent message that shattered my heart but bolstered my conviction. "Dad," I said, my voice shaking slightly as I stepped forwards, "I think it's best if I come with you today." Walter scoffed, retorting too quickly, "Oh come on, it's just a checkup. You don't need to coddle him like this." Each syllable felt like barbed wire wrapped around the words, tugging at something primal and repulsive inside me. A scream clawed at the back of my throat, fought tooth and nail against the savagery consuming my rationality. "This isn't just a checkup," I shot back defensively. "It's one of the most significant days he'll have in months. You don't need to be there. You're not his family." My father blinked, a flicker of recognition in his eyes, but Walter's reaction was sinister in nature. It turned from shock to thin-lipped anger, a quiet promise of retribution hidden beneath tightly wound lips. The tension crackled in the air like pre-storm electricity, and suddenly, I felt as if every single unwelcome thought I'd buried deep beneath the surface burrowed its way back into prominence, revealing the possibility that Walter could very well be a wolf in sheep's clothing, his concerns surprisingly coordinated with plans I couldn't even fathom. "Fine," Walter said, a smile creeping back onto his face like a spider waiting for its chance to snag its prey, "but you'll see, my support was what he needed after all." As my father slipped on his coat and I ushered him forward, I dared not glance back at Walter, but a cold chill washed over me, an irrational fear gnawing at my insides like rats feasting on the carcass of my worst nightmares. The ride to the hospital was a silent war zone. I searched for the right words to calm my racing heart. My dad nodded, oblivious to my internal struggle, as I feigned casual conversation about the upcoming baseball season, drowning every overture of worry beneath a thin ocean of pleasantries. When we finally arrived, the walls around us seemed to close in with every passing moment, and as we stepped into the sterile waiting room, I couldn't shake the unsettling feeling that Walter was lurking just beyond the proximity of that polished glass entrance. Hours passed slowly, dragging our spirits into the unforgiving jaws of uncertainty, each tick of the clock as menacing as the last. When my father was finally called in for his examination, I was asked to wait, and though I tried to maintain an air of nonchalance, my heart thudded painfully, each beat a reminder of everything I feared. And then, without warning, there he was, Walter, striding into the waiting area, face plastered with a sinister blend of smugness and feigned concern. "Good news, huh?" he chirped, as if the world shrank around us to conform to his twisted whims. "I'll be here for my dear friend no matter what." My stomach churned, wrestling the truth that clawed at me. "Walter, you shouldn't be here," I stammered, a fight tangled within me against the absurdity of the interview. "Why do you keep coming around?" The look that fell across Walter's face was something indescribably dark as he stepped closer. "Because someone has to ensure he receives the care he deserves. It would be a shame if something happened to him, by virtue of not having the right people around." The nuance painted in his words dripped with malevolence, the air locked in a state of compression as realization dawned on me. I leapt back, a chill overtaking my skin. "You've been sending anonymous messages, haven't you? You've been trying to manipulate him." My accusations hung in the air, feeble but resonating with the truth crashing against my consciousness. Without uttering a word, he leaned closer, and I felt the walls closing in. It was as if my head spun, revelations crashing like glass against stone, the fraying thread of trust unraveling before my very eyes. I fled from him, desperate to reach my father's side, my heart racing, echoing the silent screams spinning in my mind. But by the time I pushed past the nurses to enter the examination room, the words I'd rehearsed had turned to dust on my tongue. My father lay back, a weary smile plastered on his face, and I caught the flicker of confusion in his eyes as he met my gaze. My heart sank. He didn't see the monster lurking just beyond the hospital walls. Instead, it was me, a pariah in the realm of protectiveness. I rushed towards him, wanting nothing more than to mount a defense against the darkness crawling into our lives. "Dad, you need to." Just as I began to explain, Walter sauntered into the room, seamlessly sliding into the space like he owned it. "You can't live in fear anymore. You have me, I'm your friend and I'm here," he insisted, his tone deceptively calm yet devoid of sincerity. My father blinked, twitching uneasily beneath the pressure of conflicting loyalties, and it felt like hours between breaths. The doctor interrupted us, and relief coiled around my heart like a snake, only for dread to nearly engulf me whole when I left the room to glimpse Walter alone with my father, whispering sweet poison that danced dangerously on the edge of tainted truth. I wrestled with the idea that I needed to pull my father from Walter's grasp. His web was spun tighter than I fathomed. I caught a glimpse of their post-reaction through the frosted glass of the door, Walter's hand resting too nonchalantly atop my father's shoulder. My chest tightened, adrenaline flooding my system, my scream almost escaping my lips when the distant conversation morphed into a grotesque display of betrayal. I burst through the doorway, and as the words tumbled from my mouth, a cacophony of emotions spiraled around me. "Leave him alone," I yelled, every ounce of fear pouring into those words. Walter turned, eyes laced with surprise. "She's just upset because she knows we're getting closer," he chirped casually, yet the menace dripping from that statement sent goosebumps racing along my skin. My father's expression, perplexed and vulnerable, tugged at my core as he looked between Walter and me. In that instant, I understood the depth of Walter's deception, the slowly curling tendrils of malice wound around my father's already fragile spirit. "You don't need him, Dad. You have me. We'll do this together," I said, my voice barely above a whisper, the weight of my realization crashing down on me in waves that threatened to encase us both. The doctor stepped in just then, canceling out the tension, and I caught Walter's eyes flicker to something behind me. I turned, electrified, a specter of dread washed over me as I realized he had a plan, something sinister orchestrated within the walls of this sterile fortress. After the appointment concluded, I insisted on finding a new oncologist, my father's indifference echoing hollow against the rising tide of my anguish. It was then that I began hearing whisperings through the townsfolk and family friends, small hints painted over Walter's troubled past, a tapestry entwined with quiet malevolence and ghost stories that left me unsettled. Nightmares haunted my sleep, each encounter with Walter grew more distorted, wrapping itself around my psyche. I couldn't let him invade our lives any longer, but how could I convince my father of the truth? Eventually, my father grew weaker, the cancer took its toll, and all the while Walter gathered around like a vulture, determined to feed off the fragments of my family. One night, after a fraught dinner where Walter's charm barely masked his undertones, I knew I had to expose him, unveil the monster for who he truly was. I called my father to the living room. By now he was frail and pale, and I could see the shadows that tag-teamed with Walter's presence. It felt as though the very air shimmered with an unreadable tension. "Dad," I began slowly, "we need to talk about Walter. I want to share what I discovered." The moment I uttered his name, the familiar gleam of disapproval glimmered in my father's eyes, and I could see Walter's shadows stretching across the room like dark wings, encircling me in his grasp. "Don't listen to her, old friend," Walter interjected smoothly, "she's just scared of losing you. We all know she tends to exaggerate, don't we?" But my father shook his head, tired but urgent. I could feel his heart battling against the manipulation lurking behind Walter's facade. "You need to understand, he's not what you think he is. He's been lying to you about his intentions." The room stilled, and in that breathless silence, my mind raced. "He's been sending anonymous letters to make it seem like you're worse off than you are. He's trying to take control of the decisions and manipulate you," Walter chuckled, feigning a mockery of restraint. "Sweetheart, isn't it sad how desperately she clings to this idea to keep herself relevant?" But my father narrowed his eyes, a fleeting clarity washing over him. Yet in the wreckage of dissected truth, chaos erupted, and Walter's visage morphed into a furious beast as he lunged towards me, venom dripping from his smile. "You ungrateful little rat. After everything I've done for you, you dare defile my name?" The vulnerability I clung onto began crumbling, and my heart raced as I dove towards my father's side with a growl that reverberated through the walls of our home. This was a battle for survival, a last fight to ensure he wouldn't succumb to the poison oozing from Walter. "Dad, please, you need to believe me," I cried desperately, as Walter's towering presence threatened to engulf us both. I realized then that Walter's grip had taken a form we hadn't yet acknowledged, a resonance of death that fed upon our house like a cancer of its own, and with a flicker of realization, I could feel the shadows pulling at my father's breath, tightening beyond relief. I composed myself, lending everything my heart had against the suffocating wall of Walter, and declared, "If you love him, you'll let him go." Walter's laughter lingered, a cacophony that seemed to bounce off the walls before a sudden silence erupted, and I watched in horror as my father hesitated, a flicker of recognition lighting his eyes. The horror spiraled as I made the realization that his only allies were the ghosts of Walter's manipulation, wielding the tenacity of a predator ready to feast. But I refused to back down. I had so much more to say. I needed him to grasp the truth, and it screamed louder than Walter's veiled threats. A moment of poise fell, and when Walter clenched his jaw, I knew that I didn't just seek to save myself but to out anyone who stood even in the periphery of my father's existence. "You may think that you're infallible, but the weight of your lies will bury you." My heart felt like it was shattering, the final pleads vibrating within my own empathy as the walls held their breath, and somewhere deep inside, I felt shivers slither across the threshold. I waited, holding the air, straining for a crack in Walter's facade, searching for the slightest glimpse of vulnerability. "Enough," Walter roared, collapsing into a distorted semblance of rage, his mask peeling away. "You think you can just take him away? He's mine. I thought you had a stronger bond with him. This is how it has always been." With a growing intensity, the air thrummed, the rage pulsed within the room, and as Walter's frustration peaked, it felt like a storm encroaching upon us. If I could just hold on to my father, a newfound strength carving a connection between us, perhaps we could find redemption. The distance and estrangement cloaked the air, but fury ferreted out the truth hidden within. I stepped forward once more, offering my hand to my father, anchoring him against Walter's maelstrom. "Let's leave together," I said softly, my heart desperate against the agony of losing the pivotal relationship to a monster who had no right to claim him. At that moment, an eerie stillness descended, and I witnessed the shifting shadows around us, the fatigue that racked my father's frail body battling against the tendrils snaking from Walter's malevolent smile. "You can't save him from the truth," Walter whispered, "he will always be with me. No more." I thought fiercely, feeling a tide of my voice igniting the calm spaces surrounding us. "No, we can build a future together." The ugly truth revealed as we stepped outside, leaving behind a fragment of itself while welcoming ourselves into the light of new beginnings, the future flickering before us, painstaking yet full of promise. But the last whispers of Walter's proposition wouldn't simply vanish, they lingered behind us like shadows demanding acknowledgement. Weeks passed, during which our home transformed, dwindling specters fading out and acceptance pulling us back into the warmth of family. The truth clocks in, pieces falling into place, as I began helping Dad in ways I feared to lose. But bursts of fear often struck at night. Even though Walter's grip had lessened, the remembrance of what bruised betrayal could do festered as an unease spinning in cycles. It wasn't until one dark, moonless night when nightmares draped themselves around my father and rushed towards the door, a frantic rap echoing against the rich silence. Reading the moment, I approached the door cautiously, the fury of nervous energy surging beneath my skin as the wood groaned beneath my grip. Who could it be? I hesitated, remembering all too clearly the edges that Walter put upon our existence. When I finally opened it, the chill in the air carried the sharp scent of fear. My father blinked, utterly confused, forged in the alleys of worry, and now burdened further by uncertainty. "It's him, isn't it?" I murmured, my heartbeat harmonizing with the echoes surrounding me. "He's coming back for us." The trepidation clouded his expression, and as doubt etched itself deep within my father's brow, I could feel the shadows once more. It felt like the beginning swirling beneath the surface, remnants of a battle unearthed. "You're not going back there," I breathed firmly, feeling the weight of resolution solidifying around us as the seconds dwindled into eternity. Yet Walter wasn't finished. I could feel those eyes probing our defenses, waiting to reclaim the fragments he sought, to wrap them once more within the binding tales of betrayal and tendrils with which he'd strangled our past. A decision rested firmly between us. I steeled my resolve against every ounce of anxiety, fitfully battling against the shadows that might lie ahead. I had freed us once, and I wouldn't surrender with the chains of fear tethered once more. As the door creaked behind me, I knew this wasn't the end. It was the beginning of a stronger bond forged beneath harrowing trials and solidified through every grain of untold sacrifice. I had to convince my father that vulnerability was the foundation of our freedom, that the shadows could only do harm if we allowed them entry. Together, we would endure, for the truth of family burned brighter than the cold encroaching darkness, one which I refused to let win its relentless battle over us. And in that commitment, I felt the darkness encroach upon us, twist into unseen dimensions. Even if Walter tried re-entering our space, I would not let him reclaim the love that remained. I fought for every shred of hope, for every moment that manifested genuine bonds forged through solemnity, warmed by genuine love. It was in that resolve that we pushed back against the darkness, into the light of possibility, the kind that promised liberation from chains that could never be fastened against family, of a future beyond the haunting whispers of Walter's name, long faded yet wordlessly existing, intertwining real ties and those infernal shadows hovering just outside our reach. I never thought refusing to give candy to my neighbor's kids could spiral into something so terrifying, but that's how the nightmare began. It started innocently enough. It was Halloween, and like every year, I had stocked up on the usual assortment of sweets, but this time, I was adamant about not giving any to the children who lived next door. You see, that family had moved in just a few months prior, and their kids, 2 boys named Jake and Sam, were anything but normal. Sure, at first glance, they seemed like regular kids, dressed up as superheroes and goblins just like everyone else, but there was always something off about their laughter. It echoed too loudly, cutting through the comforting air of the evening like a serrated knife, and their smiles stretched a little too wide, revealing too much of their teeth. When they came to my door that evening, I felt the dread knotting in my stomach as I looked down at their expectant faces, makeup smeared and gleaming like freshly spilled blood under the streetlight. I simply shook my head, muttered a polite sorry, and closed the door quickly, heart racing because as soon as I did, they stepped back and their expressions morphed from disappointment to something almost predatory. I pressed my ear against the door, expecting them to turn away, but instead, I could hear whispers, words I couldn't quite make out, conversations swaying and twisting in the air until it felt like even the walls were sharpening their ears, and then, with a slight click, I saw the doorknob turn, my heart dropping into my stomach. I rushed to check the locks, my breath hitching, and when I glanced back at the door, their faces were close against the glass, eyes wide and unblinking, pupils dilated like black holes ready to swallow me whole. I felt a chill run down my spine. Something wasn't right. Later that night, I locked the doors and pulled the curtains tight, hoping to drown out the relentlessness of their sadistic giggles echoing through the dark. At midnight, I heard a sudden thud against the side of the house, my heart leapt, panic clawing at my throat, and I peeked out from the window. They stood there, cloaked in shadows, still wearing their costumes, but something else flickered in their eyes, a mischief so sinister it sent tremors sparking through my veins. I decided to call the police, dialing with shaking fingers, and as I whispered my fears into the phone, the operator's voice faded into a distant stream of incoherence while I watched through the blinds as the children began to move away, stage whispering to each other, as if plotting something insidious, their brazen confidence fueling a dark weight of inevitability in my stomach. I hung up the phone, listening for sirens that never came while I recalled every warning my mother had given me about children who looked too perfect, acting too strange, those warnings blurring with the image of their wide, gleaming smiles piercing through the night air. As the hours edged closer to dawn, the atmosphere thickened, like fog curling around my ankles, whispers suddenly morphing into faint, high-pitched giggles that echoed through the silence of my home. I thought of calling out, confronting them, telling them to go home, to leave me alone, but the tightly wound ball of fear kept me glued to my spot. Instead, I wandered through my house, turning on every light like a moth drawn to reassurance, the manic laughter substituting for the innocence of children's games. It wasn't until I heard a light knock at my back door that I felt the color drain from my face. I stayed silent, hoping it was a trick of the wind, but then again came the knock, this time sharp and insistent. I decided I couldn't ignore them any longer. My curiosity had grown too vast, pulling me forward toward the back door. I cracked it open just a fraction, and I saw them, the 2 boys standing there, their costumes barely illuminated by the dim glow of the porch light. But they weren't just looking for candy anymore. Their faces were now almost nurturing, almost saccharine, and they spoke in murmurs that had no relation to the holiday anymore. "Aren't you lonely?" they asked, and the words slithered into my mind like venom, splitting open the dark corners that had learned to fear the silence. For a moment, I thought about inviting them in just to make the madness stop, to tame the swirling chaos they stirred within me, but I held my ground, glaring at their childish facade, desperate for any semblance of caution that might assert that I wasn't losing my mind so soon. "We don't bite," Sam said with a grin that seemed too sharp, two tiny daggers glimmering in the faint light. I slammed the door shut and without thinking, turned the lock, breath trembling as I stumbled back into my hallway, desperate to gather my thoughts. The night dragged on in a vicious cycle of laughter, knocks, and whispers, each sound doubling down on the anxiety pounding in my chest when suddenly, I heard it, my phone vibrating on the table. I could have sworn it was the police, patrolling the area after my call. As I looked at the screen, my heart dropped. It was a text from my neighbor, the boy's mother. It read, "There's something wrong with my boys. Don't let them in. We'll take care of it." My mind blanked in that moment, and then came the realization that I had no idea what it was, what was in those boys, and the more I thought about it, the more I began to realize, it wasn't just them. It was something divine and grotesque, a darkness like tar creeping between the walls of this quiet house, and when the electricity flickered, illuminating their faces for a split second, hands pressed against the glass, breath fogging up the pain, I knew I was stuck, lost in the entropy of my choices. Their forms pulsed in the light, eventually blending back into darkness as if they were merely shadows stitched from the fabric of fear, and then came a crashing sound, something like wood splintering against a brick wall. My breath stilled, my heart thudding against my ribcage, and I ran to the window in time to see a figure darting from my yard, but I couldn't see who it was. Was it the boys or someone else, something else? I didn't know. I didn't want to know. The night blurred past, a cacophony of terror against my ears, the boys receding back into their home, laughter fading until I could hear the heavy insistence of my own heartbeat and my breath. And before the dawn swept in, I made a decision, I would confront them. But when morning arrived, the shadows dispersed, and a calm fell across the neighborhood. The boys were gone, their family vanished without a trace. I knocked on the door of the house next door, rapping my knuckles against the splintering wood, and when it swung open, a stranger stared back at me, a woman with sunken eyes and the coldness of a grave wrapped around her silence. "Who are you looking for?" she asked, and I felt the winds shift around me. When I described the family, expecting a semblance of recognition, her gaze darkened. "I've lived here for years," she said slowly. "No children have ever lived next door." And just like that, the reality of the boys haunted me like a ghost, those monstrous smiles slicing through my sanity, echoing a question that repeated with no answer, "AITA for not giving the neighbor's kids candy?" The words now strung like a noose around my mind, tightening it into terror. And as I stumbled back into my own home, the lights flickering ominously above me, I realized that perhaps in refusing to give candy, I had given them something much worse, my fear, the key to a darkness that would never leave me. When my grandmother passed away last month, grief wrapped around me tighter than the layers of fabric in my well-worn dark gray coat, the only one I'd ever needed for funerals. It didn't matter that it was the same coat I'd worn to bury my father just a few years before. I remember standing beside my mother at the dining table, her eyes swollen, reflecting a bleak mix of sorrow and irritation as she insisted that I needed a new black coat for the funeral because, in her words, black is the color of mourning, and your father would never forgive you for showing up in dark gray. I didn't understand why a different coat mattered so much when the sorrow it cloaked was the same, but she couldn't fathom that my attachment to that gray coat went beyond aesthetics. Desperate for my own space amidst the chaos of grief, I refused her demands, feeling my heart thud heavily as family discussions dwindled to whispered criticisms directed at me, portraying me as the ungrateful son who couldn't muster the decency to honor his deceased relatives appropriately. The societal pressure to wear a fresh coat became unbearable, and as I walked through the house that echoed with muted memories of family gatherings and laughter, I felt as though the essence of my loved ones lingered in the folds of that same coat, every crease a moment shared, every thread a lesson learned. On the night before the funeral, my mother barricaded herself in her room, and I found myself outside, staring at the growing shadows of the trees in our yard, their gnarled branches twisting like the pain inside me. I was losing everything dear, quickly engulfed by an anxious fog that choked my breaths, and yet, there was a stubborn part of me that clung to that old coat like a life buoy amidst rising tides of despair. Just as I resolved to wear what I felt connected to, I saw the weathered figure of my grandmother, her spectral form flickering in the moonlight, clutching the rope in her hands, just out of my reach. She whispered secrets of the past in the rustle of the leaves, and I felt something shift in my core, a reconciliation with her essence urging me onward. When I finally slipped that coat on, its lingering scent comforting and reminiscent of days gone by, I felt her approval envelop me, more potent than any new black fabric could offer. I may have failed to meet the expectations of a mother mourning her mother, but as I walked into the funeral home the next day, my chest expanded fiercely, fusing the layers of loss into one coherent resolve. However, it wasn't the weight of the coat that caught the attention of others, it was the hushed conversations around me, the scathing glares that sliced through the room and branded me as the odd son. My heart raced as I held my breath for the eulogies, seeking solace in the heartfelt sentiments shared by relatives, but when the speech turned toward traditional attire, my heart sank. I looked around to see the disapproving glances, relatives who I'd only ever seen dressed in black now aimed to paint my grief as colors beyond the spectrum of acceptance, and I couldn't shake the feeling that the disdain and disappointment whispered behind my back echoed louder than the sorrowful words being uttered. No. I wouldn't let that coat overshadow the memories embodied in my actions. I held the fabric tight, its significance well known only to me and my grandmother, who had poured her soul into sewing all the buttons that clasped their spirit through intertwining threads of our family's legacy. Halfway through the eulogy, I stepped outside to collect my thoughts, greeted by the crisp bite of late autumn air, which felt like a bitter reprimand, punctuating that pervasive loneliness which seemed to chase me even in the company of family. My resolve wavered as the temptation to conform roared in my chest. I shuffled my feet, heart pounding as whispers about me drifted through the thin walls, shrouding me in a tempest of guilt. Did I really deserve to hold on to my memories, my grief, while causing a rift in my family? Just as doubt flooded my being, a rustling sound came from behind me, an old woman in a shabby old coat, much like mine. She didn't appear lost in sorrow but radiant in the brilliance of her past. I noticed the subtle but defiant sparkle in her eyes. She leaned in and whispered, "Tell me, dear boy, does a coat determine love? Does the ink of fabric hold the grave weight of grief, its fabric woven in time?" A second passed, and I felt the urge to spill my heart to this stranger, her presence igniting a warmth that made the chill of discontent fall away. "Be true to your love, dear heart," she continued, "that is the only thread that carries you through the veil." By the time I returned inside, I had shed the chains of my mother's expectations, ready to face the judging gasps with conviction. I reclaimed that gray coat, stigmata of love laced with mourning. It had become a monument, and I, in my unyielding stance against convention, finally understood that it wasn't a question of right or wrong. It was a testament to the bond shared with those we have buried in the earth, a visual legacy that would haunt the fabric of our lives forever. Yet, just when I believed my resolve would silence the whispers, something jolted me, something I couldn't explain. As I stood there, tears spilling down my cheeks, the air grew painfully thick. A chilling wail erupted from behind me, sending a shiver down my spine as the elderly lady's comforting presence began to dissolve into darkness, the echoes of her words transforming into a strange song filling the room. It was as if the shadows were hungry for the bonds we'd forged, ready to unravel every moment I had thought was sacred. My heart raced again, but this time, it was gripped in vice-like fear. What had I unleashed by clinging to my beloved gray coat? Suddenly, the cacophony of mourning morphed into laughter. Family members were grinning grotesquely, their faces stretching uncomfortably, eyes gleaming with desperation as if they desired to wrestle my coat from me, as if the very fabric prevented them from accessing the shared mourning we all needed to bury. As they moved toward me, engulfing my space with taunts of betrayal, I couldn't shake the feeling that something had focused on me. The burden I carried had morphed into a sort of interloper that would not allow my family the catharsis they so demanded. I was slipping into a darkness that resonated deeply from the fabric, as though the memories that should have kept me rooted were becoming malicious, dragging me into depths of despair where coats had never mattered, but souls did. They were reaching for the coat, their laughter edging into madness, and I realized the family beneath the funeral garb had become ravenous specters, controlled by their hidden grief and impossible expectations. In that moment, grief twisted sinister, submerged in a deep well that churned beneath the fabric I clung to like a lifeline, and all I could do was turn and run, abandoning the whispers, the coiling darkness that craved to drag me into their ocean of shared torment, while my heart echoed with the ghosts of memory that tangled with the whispers of goodbye. Just when I thought I'd escaped the nightmare, I fell through the door, tumbling out into the cold world, only to see the reflection of that old woman, standing on the brink of the graveyard, beckoning me back as shadows flickered around my shivering frame. I screamed, not caring who heard me, trapped between guilt and love, whispers of family now reinforcing the doom that followed on the wind. AITA. I thought to myself, clutching at the dark gray coat that reflected my soul's turmoil, feeling time unfurl as the threads of my life became wisps of mourning, as fragile and relentless as the hatred swelling within. I still remember the night I found myself sitting in the dimly lit corner of that upscale restaurant, the air thick with the scent of rich herbs and roasted meats, a place that had been a favorite haunt for my wife and me since our early days of marriage. It was a peaceful evening, the clinking of silverware and hushed murmurs wrapping around us like a soft blanket, until I noticed him, a young man, perhaps in his early 20s, sitting 2 tables down, engaged in an animated conversation with his friends, his laughter piercing through the serenity like a jackhammer. After a couple of minutes, my frustration began to bubble as he leaned back in his chair, balancing precariously on the rear legs, treating the fine dining experience like a raucous college party. I exchanged glances with my wife, who was trying to enjoy her crème brûlée, but the escalating volume of the young man's voice was unbearable. He leaned back further, tilting the chair back grotesquely, and for a split second, I could swear he was trying to show off, perhaps reliving some frat party glory days in this place that felt far too classy for such antics. It was one thing to laugh and share a good time, but this felt disrespectful, a blatant disregard for the ambience meticulously crafted by the staff. I wouldn't have intervened if it weren't for that moment when he stood up, raising his arms above his head in what could only be described as a triumphant pose, as if celebrating the success of a prank, and I snapped. Without thinking, I leaned forward, my voice firm yet calm. "Could you sit down, please?" The sudden tension wrapped around us like a noose, his laughter fading and curiosity sparked in the eyes of other diners who glanced in our direction. The young man turned to me, a mixture of surprise and disdain washing over his features, and for a moment, I thought he might explode with that youthful arrogance that comes so easily in that age. Instead, he slowly lowered his arms and sank back into his chair, a pout forming as if I had stolen his spotlight. After a few seconds of incredulous silence, his friends erupted in laughter, mockery spilling out in waves, making the atmosphere thicker still. I could feel my ears burning with embarrassment, but I held my ground, silently staring back, until the waiter approached, an unsure smile on his face, and asked if everything was all right. My wife cleared her throat and gave me a look that screamed why. I smiled awkwardly, as if I were somehow the villain in this scene, but I justified my actions. Etiquette must be respected, right? I glanced back at the group and noticed something unsettling. The young man's eyes no longer met mine, but fixated on something behind me. I turned to look, half expecting to see an imposing figure, but there was just a shadow, a flicker of something, a person perhaps, but I shrugged it off as mere paranoia, the tension in the room seeming almost palpable. The young man, now quiet, seemed to sink into the moment, returning to his typical demeanor, but I noticed the flickers in his eyes were growing more ravenous, more unstable. I thought I had controlled the situation, but something felt off, the way he kept glancing around the restaurant now, not in embarrassment or irritation but with a strange, almost fearful curiosity. When he finally stood again, it was not for another triumphant show-off but rather a nervous fidget, and that's when the place grew quiet again, all eyes glued to him, waiting, and that included mine. He stepped away from the table, his friends still oblivious as they flirted with their cocktails, and I couldn't shake the feeling that he was drawn to the far corner of the restaurant, as if he sensed something lurking in the shadows. I leaned in toward my wife, whispering that something was strange, that I didn't like this, but she rolled her eyes, insisting I let it go. I couldn't. I watched him approach the window, the lights creating a halo around his head as if illuminating his path to whatever was pulling him toward that darkness outside. Suddenly, he leaned closer to the glass, peering out as if he were staring into another realm, and I felt a shiver crawl up my spine. Just then, the lights flickered, casting the room into a brief panic of shadows, and I swear I saw something flash across his face, fear, excitement, then despair all at once. He backed away as if he had seen something that struck dread, his breath quickening, and I couldn't help but think maybe I had crossed a line by speaking up. The restaurant's hum resumed, the wait staff doing their best to maintain a charade of normalcy, but I couldn't shake that pulsing feeling growing in my gut, eerie and foreboding, as if some ancient curse had awoken from a long slumber. Everything was wrong now, from the decor to the polished silverware. The laughter felt hollow, as though a specter had begun to swirl amongst us, lingering on the edge of our consciousness. When he gradually approached his table again, now visibly on edge, something inside me braced for impact. Would he explode? Would he retaliate against my outburst? Instead, in a soft yet firm voice, he muttered something to his friends, and one of them laughed, unaware of how close to breaking he really was. With each second, I felt the weight of dread crawl closer as his laughter turned into an awkward silence, punctuated only by the creaking of wood beneath chairs and the clinking of glasses. In that moment, I was consumed by an overwhelming sense of guilt, a gut-wrenching realization. I had triggered this young man's descent into madness with a simple command to sit down, and as the clock ticked, I felt myself pulled deeper into a spiral of dread and regret, trapped in a moment that spiraled out of control until finally the shadows closed in on us all, and I wondered if I had just unleashed something dark, if perhaps it was I, the one ironically sitting down, who had finally surrendered to the sinister undercurrents of the world, forever marked by the terror of simply trying to enforce a semblance of civility. I'm not sure how to start this without sounding melodramatic, but I need to share this before it eats me alive. My friend Danny, who, like me, is 23 years old, had been pestering me to set him up with my best friend, Laura, for months. She's beautiful, smart, and genuinely one of the best people I know. We had been friends since childhood, and after a slew of terrible dates, I thought, why not? On paper, they seemed like a match made in heaven. Both love horror movies, the same music, and they both had quirky senses of humor. But every time I tried to broker this budding romance, something fell through. He would flirt with her one moment and then completely ghost her the next, and I could see how it hurt Laura when he'd vanish as if she were nothing. Finally, I confronted Danny about it. What's your deal? If you want to date her, then do it. Don't just toy with her feelings, I told him one night as we shared drinks. He shrugged it off, saying he was just busy. I didn't buy it, but I let it go, until the day they finally met up, a Friday night that still haunts me. When I got the call from Laura the next morning, I could hardly believe what I was hearing. He stood me up, and he didn't even text me to say he wouldn't come. She choked out between sobs, and as she recounted her harrowing experience waiting in that stupid cafe with her heart in her throat, I felt rage boil within me. Danny had let her wait for 2 hours before sending a text that something came up, which is code for, I couldn't care less about you. I spent the rest of the weekend comforting Laura, who couldn't understand what had gone wrong. She deserved better, and all I could think of was Danny's selfishness. The following week, I told Danny I was done helping him. AITA for refusing to set up my friend anymore after he stood up my best friend? I asked him directly, hoping for some sign of remorse, but he shrugged it off as if it didn't matter. He laughed, a hollow sound that seemed to echo in the confines of my mind, and that's when I noticed it, the change in him, something darker lurking beneath the surface. I thought it was just disappointment at being denied a date, but then things started getting weird. A few days later, Laura and I found a note on her car windshield, scrawled in handwriting I didn't recognize, reading, "You should find someone who actually wants you," and it sent chills down my spine. I dismissed it as some random jerk, but then she began receiving messages on social media from a profile with no followers or posts. The person behind it clearly knew things about her that they shouldn't have, places she frequented and inside jokes we had shared. Each time I texted Danny, he ignored me or gave flippant responses that made my stomach twist. "My bad," he'd write back. "I've been busy." I had started keeping track of the odd notes and the increasingly menacing messages Laura was receiving. They grew more and more detailed, leaning closer toward stalking. I began to wonder if it was all a sick game played by Danny to get back at Laura for humiliating him by uncovering his true nature. But I didn't confront him again, fearing what might happen if I pushed. I was convinced he was somehow involved. They were intertwined in a twisted fate that I could no longer untangle. On a freezing December evening, Laura and I went out to grab some groceries, both feeling the weight of the ominous recent events. She pulled out her phone and went pale. There it was again, a message waiting for her: "You should really stay home tonight." The lights flickered above us as a sickening chill washed over me, and I could swear that a shadow crossed over the grocery store. Moments later, Laura and I split up to grab the last few items on our list, and when I turned down the cereal aisle, I noticed a figure at the far end. His back was turned to me, but his posture was all too familiar. Panic surged through me. Danny had been sneaking around while I wasn't paying attention. I called out to him, but he didn't respond. Instead, he turned slightly, just enough for me to glimpse his face, and I felt my heart drop. It wasn't Danny at all, but someone who looked alarmingly similar, a glint of madness in his eyes. I froze, the grocery list slipping from my hands. Before I could move, he took a single step toward me, and in that moment, the lights went out. All I could hear was the sound of frantic breathing and an overwhelming sense of dread. I bolted, screaming for Laura as I raced through the store, grabbing at the edges of my sanity. I found her in the aisle, her face ghostly pale, and she was gripping her phone tightly, shaking. "Did you see him?" she whispered, and I nodded, still reeling from the terror of being so close to something I couldn't explain. In the following days, I made the hard choice to go to the police, warily explaining the situation. They brushed it off, saying it could be a prank, but something in my gut told me otherwise. Then, without warning, Laura disappeared. 1 minute she was there, and then she was gone, spilling laughter and warmth into the world, and the next, it was like she had never existed. My heart ached, frantically searching for signs of her in her usual hangouts, social media, anything, and every night I returned to my darkened apartment, guilt gnawing at my mind like the predator it had become. I finally reached out to Danny one last time, hoping against hope that he would tell me where she was, but all I got was a deadpan "you should have stayed out of it." It was a message so straightforward it cut through me, and desperation consumed me as I tried tracing back everything that had happened. It finally hit me, every dark turn we took led back to him. I couldn't let it go, and so, the next Thursday, I found myself standing outside his apartment, too many unanswered questions pulling me toward confrontation. I knocked on the door. I didn't care if I appeared insane. The door creaked open, revealing him, a sly grin stretching across his face. "Thought you might come," he said, stepping aside to let me in, as if he planned this all along. When I stepped inside, the stench hit me like a freight train. "What's wrong with you?" I managed, feeling sick. There were notes scattered everywhere, torn photographs plastered on walls, the evidence of his obsession. I saw Laura's face among them, eyes wide in terror, and it felt like my entire world collapsed. He turned to me, eyes gleaming. "She made me do this. If you had just let me have her, none of this would have happened." I staggered backward in horror as he reached for something behind him. Was it a knife? But I dipped sideways, ducking and sprinting for the door. I burst outside, adrenaline propelling me forward, and just as I neared the stairs, I heard him call after me, a low chuckle echoing through the hallway. "See you soon." I never found Laura. The police still refused to believe me. Danny is still out there, lurking, with secrets that threaten to break through the cracks of reality. As for me, I live in fear every day that he'll find me, too, because I know what he did, and he's not done yet. So, AITA for refusing to set my friend up ever again? I guess I'll never know, as I am too afraid of what darkness lies within the heart of those you think you know. The truth is, I simply can't afford to find out. When my son turned 10, I decided to throw a party to celebrate his decade of life, inviting his friends and their parents. It felt like a milestone worth marking, a chance to reflect on how quickly he was growing up. As the party flowed through laughter and games, I found myself caught in a whirlwind of memories, gazing at the walls adorned with baby pictures that I'd meticulously hung the night before, each frame a portal to the past, a past where I'd held him tightly for the first time, where every smile he gave felt like a sunbeam cutting through the darkest of nights, especially after his mother left when he was just an infant. My heart raced with nostalgia, thinking of all those moments and how they defined me not just as a parent, but as a person who had faced unimaginable fears alone, and yet I was proud of the heart I had built for him in her absence. But then came a twinge of hesitation as I noticed one of the other parents, a woman named Linda, staring at the pictures with a furrowed brow. During a lull between the games, she approached me, her voice draped in an uncomfortable seriousness that threw me slightly off balance. "You know, it might be time to let go of those baby pictures," she said, her tone gentle but firm. "He's getting older, and it could be a bit humiliating for him someday." I swallowed hard, momentarily dumbfounded as I tried to process the idea of erasing those memories, but I brushed it off, laughing lightly and assuring her that these pictures represented our journey, my love for him immortalized in playful moments. AITA for not deleting my son's baby pictures. I wondered later, but the question lingered uncomfortably. The party continued, disappointment lurking beneath the surface, and as guests slowly departed, I tucked my son into bed. That night, as he drifted off, I sat in the dim light of his room, haunted by Linda's words. The following days fell into an uneasy silence between my son and me. He began withdrawing, his laughter replaced by a hesitant smile, and I couldn't help but feel the pull of something sinister. Was he ashamed of the very memories I cherished? Instead of confronting him directly, I began looking for clues, digging through his schoolwork and activities, hoping to find hints about his secret life outside our home. I found nothing but admiration from his teachers and joy from his friends, yet unease still gnawed at me. His 10th birthday came and went, and that very night, the pictures I had painstakingly hung around the party began to vanish. One by one, they disappeared, and soon, I noticed a pattern as they obscured themselves from me. It was unsettling, knowing moments of my life slipped into untraceable voids, a feedback loop of shadows burying my son's childhood. Every morning, I would awaken determined to hold on to those memories, only to find more of them stripped away, their absence as palpable as the thick blankets of fog that seemed to weave around our house. Desperation carved itself into my heart, driving me to search for digital copies, but attempts to retrieve those files yielded nothing. Friends began to wonder if I was okay, issuing soft words of concern, and I was met with laughter in my son's eyes that grew dimmer every day. The vividness of our shared memories morphed into something dark, and I began waking in the middle of the night, the sensation of tiny fingers grasping at my arm becoming an alarming comfort. I told myself it was just a trick of mine, my exhausted mind grasping at nightmares, but still, there was something sinister lurking beneath the surface, a whisper echoing through the house, saying that I needed to forget, I needed to let go. One evening, I decided to confront my son, asking him directly if he was ashamed of those memories. His shocked look told me all I needed to know, and that's when I noticed it, the first time I had laid eyes on the creeping shadows lining his room, clouds that seemed to pulse and swell. "No, I love those pictures," he finally whispered, but his voice dripped with a kind of languid fear, as if he was too afraid to fight against whatever was smothering the room. In that moment, I realized it wasn't him who felt the weight of shame, it had been someone else all along. Drawing courage from within, I stepped into the room, clenching my fists as the shadows writhed around us like living things, and I shouted the names of every moment, every joyous picture, calling out to those memories before time could bleed them away. In a dizzying surge, the darkness began to retreat, but it was only then I noticed the mirror across the room, its surface reflecting a chilling tableau, dark eyes watching from the other side, a twisted glimpse of a figure I could not comprehend. The realization settled like ice in my veins. The more I tried to hold on to my son's memories, the further they slipped, and every night, I felt that unknown presence slipping through the veil, reclaiming what it believed belonged with it. Either my son or those memories were to be consumed, and I had to make a choice. Heart pounding, I reached for my son, pulling him towards me just as the night enveloped the room in a heavy shroud, but somehow, I sensed the darkness closing in behind us, a whirlwind of dread that seemed to materialize with malevolence. "Don't let go, please," he cried, and I realized that letting go meant giving in to the shadows. With every ounce of strength I possessed, I wrenched open the window, the cool night air rushing in, trying to breathe life back into the fading memories. Every laugh, every moment our hearts shared cascaded into the open air like a haunting melody, and just when I thought the shadow might consume us both, I roared into the night, "I will not let you take them." In that instant, the very fabric of my reality warped, as if the essence of those memories surged back into the room, a blaze of light igniting the darkness, scattering it into nothingness, and for once, I felt our memories solidify around us. But as dawn broke, and we emerged from that battle, I was left alone to confront the remnants of what we had faced. Around us lay remnants of old photographs burned into ashes at the foot of the window, as if those memories had indeed been claimed but then lifted from existence. What remained were the shards of those years, a reminder of the battle where every picture held fragments of our past. As I looked into my son's eyes, knowing the laughter we had shared would forever echo in the silence, I realized I hadn't just fought for memories, I had fought for his childhood. But in that realization lurked a more sinister truth: I couldn't outrun the darkness. While memories might fade, would the malevolence that sought to erase what we loved ever truly let go? I'm left with an irrefutable question: AITA for not deleting my son's baby pictures. Because in this haunting memory of loss, maybe I'm still trapped in a sinister echo, fighting not to forget. I'm not one to air my dirty laundry in public, but this has started to feel like a living nightmare, and I can't shake the feeling that something isn't right. It began a few months ago when my husband, Greg, started bringing home a collection of vintage radios he found at estate sales. I thought it was a quirky yet harmless hobby, but soon his obsession took a twisted turn. He'd spend hours tinkering away in our dimly lit basement, meticulously restoring each radio, which at first felt endearing, but later it morphed into something more sinister. It was the way he talked to them, like they were old friends or confidants. He'd sit cross-legged on the floor, fiddling with the dials, murmuring, "It's all right, buddy, we'll get you fixed up soon," and I couldn't shake off the chill running down my spine each time I heard him. It drove me mad with worry, yet I brushed it off as one of those midlife crises that men seem to have. Then one night, after another exhausting day at work, I just snapped. I stood at the foot of the basement stairs, shivering as I listened to another muffled, almost pleading voice emanating from the radios, distorted but strangely urgent. Suddenly, a cacophony of static interrupted the night, and the voice seemed to weave through the cracks, promising unseen things like events to come or secrets better left unearthed. My heart raced, and I screamed down the stairs, "Shut up, Greg." It echoed in the walls, reaching an unnatural pitch as an unsettling silence fell over the room. I just wanted it to end, his nights of obsessive tinkering that pulled him deeper into madness while I stood helpless, watching him slip away, one radio at a time. He appeared moments later, confusion painted on his face, and I saw the way he almost flinched at my outburst. I panicked, feeling the weight of the night pressing down on me like a suffocating blanket. "It's not me," he insisted, his voice trembled, emotion heavy in the silence. But it couldn't have been anything else. I noticed a new radio near the stairs, an old RCA model with the eeriest of designs, weathered and tarnished, as if it had been pulled from a grave. "You have to stop this," I begged, my voice cracking, tears blurring my sight as shadows flickered in the corner of my vision. He turned away, mumbling something I couldn't decipher, racing back into the basement as the static returned, washing over me like a haunting wave. Almost nightly, Greg would descend into that basement filled with technological nightmares, each repair entrenching him deeper in a cycle, while I lay awake, haunted by the murmurings of voices that twisted through the floors like an underground river of secrets. The static grew louder, more persistent, rising in unison with my anxiety until insomnia claimed its throne. My husband, so consumed by whatever he was chasing, became a ghost in our home. I missed the small gestures, his laughter, and the warmth we'd once shared. "You'll regret it," a voice floated from the radio one evening, its tone chilling, as if it were mocking my desperate pleas to save my husband and reclaim the life we once had. I decided I couldn't let it spiral any further. I rummaged through the basement one evening, ready to confront whatever was festering in the dark when I felt the radios watching me. More than just machines, they were menacing, malevolent eyes that drew me into their magnetic hold. That night, I pulled one from its place beneath Greg's clutter and brought it back upstairs, flinging it onto the kitchen table. "You want to talk?" I shouted, edging closer as I flipped the switch on. A jarring screech filled the air, and I immediately regretted the choice. I could have sworn I felt a chill grip my heart as I crouched near it. Rather than finding the static, I heard a voice clearer than before, yet it was Greg's, wrapped in layers of regret and something darker. "I told you not to listen." My stomach sank, pulling me deeper into a black pit of fear as I realized this was not just a radio, it was a vessel, a conduit for something that had crept into our lives, turning my husband into a hollow shell consumed by static and whispers of things I couldn't understand. "Make it stop," I pleaded, desperation clawing at my throat as the voice twisted my thoughts around like vines choking the life from a tree. The radio crackled. "You should have listened." I dropped it, my heart pounding like a war drum, the echoes haunting my mind, and in that instant, Greg stood behind me, his eyes wild, unfocused as if he were looking through me rather than at me. I took a step back, fear radiating from my every sense, and mumbled an apology, but all he did was shake his head slowly, a sorrowful expression creeping across his features. "You don't understand," he whispered, his voice breaking as he reached out, fingers trembling as they brushed against the vintage radio, almost as if trying to beg it for forgiveness. "It won't end until I'm finished." Something in me snapped anew as I knew I had to take a stand. So much of him was trapped down there, I could feel it like a frayed string of yarn unraveling into madness, and before he could fully comprehend, I grabbed the radio, my heart racing, smashing it against the floor with a sickening crack, the voice wailing as pieces exploded. In an instant, his expression morphed into a sharp, raging understanding, like a fuse had been lit. "What have you done?" Silence fell like a heavy blanket as I held my breath, terrified I'd unleashed some unknown horror. When he lunged at me, it surprised even myself. I flung myself backward, landing against the countertop, my heart racing like a runaway train. "You're not yourself," I shouted back at him, my own panic-laden voice filled with the raw edge of fear. And suddenly, it became apparent, this wasn't just a hobby gone awry, it was something greater, clawing into every crevice of our lives, testing our trust, our love, and I realized that letting it consume us would mean losing everything I held dear. The basement rattled, a deep rumble emanating from below, as if the radios were screaming all at once, unseen cries of the damned that echoed through our home. I felt fragile from the weight it threatened to crush me with, and as I faced my husband, seeing the shadows of the old radio flickering behind him, despair washed over me. But it wasn't just despair, it was a promise, a whisper caressing my ear, warning me of the dark abyss waiting to swallow us whole if I didn't fight with everything I had left. "We can fix this," I shouted, emotions surging like tidal waves, "but you need to see the truth." His expression shifted, and for a moment, the shadows behind him seemed to relent, flickering like fading embers, as if my words echoed just enough to ignite a flicker of clarity deep within him. With each heartbeat, I felt the bond trying to mend, the air charged with the remnants of names unspoken and hopes tethered to unseen forces. "Please." I barely managed to breathe, tears flooding my vision. "I don't want to lose you." And just like that, something sparked in those hollow eyes. For a split second, I saw my husband emerge from the depths of shadows, an insistent flicker of warmth breaking through the cold facade. But then the shadows behind Greg twisted malevolently, deep laughter, sly and insistent, trickled out, reminding me of how close he had come to losing himself entirely. The moment shattered as I felt chilling breaths emanating from the ruins of the shattered radio, its remnants still alive with echoes of things unnamed. I stormed out, but as I reached the front door, turning back nervously, my heart sank. His silhouette was gone, and in its place was an impenetrable dark, with static rising hauntingly in the air. "Shut up!" I screamed into the void, a raw shout of defiance against the encroaching darkness. In the eerie stillness that followed, I genuinely wondered if I would ever get my husband back, or if he was now nothing more than a note in a forgotten song, static lost to the frequencies of madness. And now, as I type this, I keep glancing at that basement door, terrified that one day I might hear his voice calling, urging me to join him in the void, asking if I would finally understand what it meant to listen. Or if in that moment, I'd finally lose my last chance to save him from the creeping horrors that whispered in the night. I never thought a simple plate of brownies could tear my life apart, but then again, nothing about my girlfriend, Lisa, was ever simple. We'd just moved in together after dating for almost a year, and while she was the sweetest person I'd ever met, there were these odd flashes of darkness that occasionally surfaced, like that time I found her staring out the window at the neighbors, grinning eerily, a finger pressed to her lips, and she just muttered something about keeping the family together. I chalked it up to her quirky personality. We all have our weirdness, right? So, when she came home one evening bubbling with excitement, holding a plate of brownies she'd baked from scratch, I genuinely wanted to be thrilled about it, but something felt off. The scent wafting through the apartment was heavenly, rich chocolate mixed with a hint of vanilla, yet it felt tainted with an inexplicable weight. She placed them on the table, her eyes sparkling with anticipation as if they were the manifestation of her love for me, and I wanted to tell her how fantastic they looked, but bile crept up my throat. I hesitated, glancing at her. "I'm not really hungry," I muttered, hoping she'd merely brush it off, but instead, she flared up like a match ignited by the spark of a breath. "You don't like them?" she shouted, and despite the ghostly shadows that danced just beyond her smile, it hit me like a freight train. I'd stepped on hallowed ground. I tried to defend myself, to explain that it was just a lack of appetite and not a reflection of her baking skills, but that only seemed to deepen the frown that replaced her earlier glee. Fighting the sensation of dread gnawing at me, I retreated to my room, needing the safety of solitude to gather my thoughts, but it felt like a prison. I couldn't shake the feeling that I'd awakened something I shouldn't have, and as the hours passed, I could hear her moving around in the kitchen, soft mutterings merging with the darkening night. Eventually, sleep dragged me into a nightmare I'd never forget. I saw Lisa standing above me, her face illuminated by the soft glow of moonlight streaming through the window, but there was something unsettling about her smile, something predatory, yet she offered me a brownie, insistent, as the shadows coiled around her in an embrace. I woke with a start, sweat-soaked sheets clinging to my skin, the faintest echo of her whisper still ringing in my ears, a siren's lure, "Just one, darling." When morning came, an overwhelming unease clung to my chest like a weight, and I avoided her gaze over breakfast, worried about how drastically my words had shifted the atmosphere. "Are you sure you don't want to try one?" she asked, a tremor of desperation more than mere sweetness creeping into her tone. I'll save them for later, I replied vaguely, but I meant it more as a peace offering than genuine interest. However, days turned into weeks, and inevitably, the uneaten brownies loomed like a specter, in the corner of our home, a silent reminder of my supposed ingratitude. The tension crackled like static in the air, thick and almost electric, until one fateful evening, that familiar plate of brownies made a terrifying return. Lisa approached me with a different energy, her smile was tight and her eyes glimmered ominously. I found a way to make them even better, she declared, and I could hardly recognize the voice coming from her lips. I feigned enthusiasm, but inside, an instinct screamed at me to flee. What could she possibly mean by better? My mind raced, recalling snippets of conversations we had about organic ingredients, the herbs she was so into that I dismissed as harmless eccentricities. I felt the walls closing in around me as she set the plate down and leaned closer, her gaze almost molten. "You're still upset I made them, aren't you?" she asked, the innocent facade peeling away like paint from an old wall. "I'm not ungrateful, Lisa. Really, it was just," she cut me off with a derisive laugh that chilled me to the bone, and suddenly, it all spiraled into a confrontation neither of us wanted but couldn't seem to escape. I screamed something about her obsession with those brownies, how her moods hinged on my reaction to them, and that's when I saw it, a flash of something lurking in her eyes, something dark and consuming. "You don't understand," she hissed, taking a step back, the slight tremor of her voice betraying what brutality lurked beneath. "Once you've tasted my brownies, there's no going back. You'll want more. I promise." The way she smiled made my skin crawl, like a snake licking its lips before it strikes, and I knew then that my refusal was merely a prelude to something horrific. Panic surged, I needed to leave and put distance between myself and the sinister weight of her words. I slammed the door behind me, vowing to never return, but in the night, as darkness crushed the light, her voice followed me. "You'll regret this," she promised, each syllable dripping with malice as I ran into the streets, desperate to escape my own mind. Days turned into nightmares. I could feel her watching me, waiting, as the uneaten brownies sat like a silent curse in the corner of my dreams. Friends grew concerned, I could hardly hold a conversation, paranoia wrapped me in an icy grip, and I convinced myself that she could sense my fear like a predator stalking prey. I moved in with a friend, but every creak of the floorboards felt like her footsteps trailing me, every shadow reminding me of her wide grin, and those damned brownies flashed in my mind like a harbinger of doom. Then one evening, just as I was curling up on the couch with trembling hands, there was a knock at the door, a seemingly benign sound, yet it sent ice coursing through my veins. I approached cautiously, peeking through the peephole, and there she was, Lisa, standing with that same plate of brownies held against her chest like a shield, her hair wild and disheveled, a manic light in her eyes. "You didn't say goodbye," she said sweetly, and before I could respond, I found myself under the spell of her haunting smile. The door flew open, and I was trapped in that infernal gaze. "I made them for you. Just one, darling, and everything will be all right," she murmured, words curling around me like tendrils of smoke. In that moment, all I could do was stare at the brownies, their dark, glossy surface beckoning me closer, the aroma filling my nostrils with a singular promise, bliss. I swayed slightly, teetering between hunger and fear, but then I saw something in the swirl of chocolate, something darker than mere sweets, something deep and twisted, teeth, shining stark white against the dark backdrop. I stumbled back, horror flooding through me as I realized she hadn't been baking at all but crafting a sinister concoction meant to bind me to her forever. "You'll regret not eating them," she said, her voice reverberating through my entire being, and as I ran, her laughter echoed behind me, melding into the shadows, intertwining with every dark corner of my mind. As I sprinted away from the apartment, I knew then what I had truly awakened. This was her devotion, a sacrifice they didn't tell you about in romantic fairy tales, and there was no way to uneat the brownies I hadn't tasted. They had already taken a piece of me. Last summer, my friend Brian dared me to jump on his new trampoline after school, but I just shrugged it off, claiming I wasn't in the mood. Honestly, I felt a strange unease whenever I went near it, as if it were more of a portal than a simple backyard attraction. Brian was relentless, teasing me about being scared and insisting that it was perfectly safe, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. You see, he had gotten that trampoline the previous weekend, almost impulsively, after attending a yard sale that offered it for a steal because the family was moving away quickly. As I tried to walk away from his persistent offers, I overheard Brian mention something about how the trampoline seemed alive to his little brother, Timmy, who was only 5 and had already developed this eerie attachment to it. I chuckled nervously, brushing off the remark, but later that night, I heard Timmy's laughter drifting into my window, and the sound was oddly distorted, a kind of echoing giggle that made the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. When I told Brian about it the next day, he downplayed it, saying Timmy was just being a kid. Still, I couldn't help but remember the murmurings I had heard from the other kids at school, whispers about the last owners of that trampoline, the couple who vanished without a trace, leaving their house in disarray and their yard littered with the remnants of a normal family life. As days turned into weeks, and each day brought an increasing intensity of Timmy's obsession with the trampoline, I became more uneasy. I could often see him out there, springing into the air, laughing uncontrollably as if the trampoline was buoying him to new heights of joy. But every now and then, he would stop mid-jump, tilting his head as if listening to something from the shadows of their large oak tree. Finally, one late afternoon, I relented and agreed to join Brian and Timmy. As I climbed onto the trampoline, the surface felt unnaturally warm under my feet, almost pulsing, like it had a heartbeat. I tried to force a smile, bouncing gently, but that sensation of unease returned tenfold. It wasn't fear of falling, it was an instinctive dread that clawed at my stomach, warning me to get out before it was too late. Within minutes, Timmy returned to jumping, his laughter now edging towards something sinister. He would occasionally stop, staring wide-eyed at the ground, and that's when it hit me. I couldn't quite tell if he was laughing or if he was being called to something I couldn't see, a siren song that made him float just a little too close to the edge of sanity. That night, I lay in my bed, tossing and turning, unable to shake the feeling that the trampoline had changed something in Timmy. It wasn't just a plaything anymore. I can't explain it rationally, but I started having dreams, vivid and grotesque, dreams of wide-open spaces and crooked shadows, of children jumping in circles, their laughter resonating into an empty abyss. I woke in a cold sweat, and when I glanced out the window, there was Timmy again, bouncing on the trampoline beneath the pallid light of the moon, but this time, it was just him, alone, with that faint aura of something in the air, a palpable tension simmering beneath the surface. By the end of that week, Timmy's parents pulled him away from the trampoline, claiming it was time for bed. But I knew better. I could see how the glow of the moonlight dimmed to a dull hue, the energy changing palpably as their home became quieter. The very next morning, though, I was jolted awake by the sound of frantic knocks on my door. It was Brian, panting and wide-eyed. He said Timmy had vanished from his room, and the last time anyone saw him, he had been headed toward the trampoline. My heart raced as we sprinted down the street, the sun glaring down unforgivingly, making our urgency feel desperate. As we neared the house, I could sense an oppressive aura surrounding that backyard, as if the air itself was warning me. We found Timmy standing still on the trampoline, fully awake, staring deeply into the air above him. Brian called out to him, but there was no response. He didn't even blink. I felt paralyzed. The laughter from earlier was gone, replaced with a heavy silence that froze the bone. I grabbed Brian and pulled him back as I gasped for breath. I suddenly realized that Timmy looked older, his little face somehow transformed by the week's events. Then, just like that, he jumped. And kept going. Higher and higher, defying all laws of gravity, until he reached an impossible altitude, hovering suspended in midair with a glint of wild joy in his eyes, a dark and glittering promise that horrified me. "Timmy, get down," Brian shouted in desperation as I felt my stomach drop. Something was terribly wrong. Timmy turned and held out a tiny hand, as if inviting us to join him in that eerie state of bliss, but it was too late. Before we could comprehend what was happening, he was swallowed by a cloud of shadows that erupted from the edges of the trampoline, swallowing the sunlight and everything with it, leaving us standing breathless on a hollow lot, gasping at the absence of laughter where there once was pure childhood joy. I was left haunted by the thought that I had refused to jump that day, that despite my instincts screaming at me to stay away from that thing, I did nothing to protect Timmy. I watched as Brian collapsed to his knees, screaming for his brother in desperation, while I stood rooted on the ground, knowing the truth that I could never share, that sometimes, the thrill of the jump is a gateway to something darker, something that doesn't want to be found. Weeks passed, but the trampoline remained there, a grim reminder of our stupidity, our refusal to listen to instinct rather than the shrieking laughter of a child that felt all too inviting. To this day, I wonder if giving in would have turned the tides, if perhaps Timmy and I could have escaped those sinister depths together, but now, all I hear is the echo of his laughter from the lifeless backyard, making me question, was I truly the idiot for not jumping on that trampoline? When I was a little girl, I dreamt of my wedding day with a fervor that would make even the most hard-hearted cynical adult roll their eyes, and if you had asked me then, I would have told you that my dream dress was a breathtaking pink gown, the kind that twirled like cotton candy beneath layered lights at sunset. Fast forward to my engagement, and my fiancé, Derek, was everything I could ask for. His smile lit up my world, and his laughter felt like home. But when I finally unveiled my cherished vision of a pink wedding dress to him, the look on Derek's face fell faster than I could catch it. He chuckled, which only deepened the crease across his brow. I pictured white, you know. Traditional. For the photos. As if my heart hadn't already begun to sink, I tried to brush off his hesitation, assuring him that love was what mattered most, and pink could be the essence of our shared joy. I revisited the boutique alone, the walls decorated in thousands of hues of white, and there, hanging like a forgotten story was my original vision, a delicate pink dress, with a satin underlay that shimmered like the dawn. I slipped it on and stood before the mirror, and for the briefest moment, I felt perfect. I chose to go ahead with what my heart desired and marked the day with pink every step of the way, a pink cake, pink flowers, even pink shoes. What should have been a joyful time took a perilous turn when I announced those plans at our engagement party, where friends and family gathered, the city skyline glowing behind them. Family members gave polite claps, but I noticed my mother's jaw tighten and my grandmother's eyes narrow. What happened to the beautiful white wedding dresses? My mother questioned, her tone dripping with disapproval. It felt as if the air thickened, my smile wavering under the weight of their stares. Derek, after lagging behind with a muted expression, pulled me aside later, voicing his concerns in a hushed whisper, words about tradition and expectations spilling forth, drowning me in regret. You know it's important to my family, right? The doubt nestled itself in my stomach like a lead weight. My heart raced as he tried to convince me that I should reconsider, but it was too late to turn back. I was headfirst submerged in a sea of satin pink and deep disappointment. I had visions of our special day twisting like a terrifying dream I couldn't wake from, and the anxiety seeped into the planning, igniting late-night arguments that pushed him away from me instead of drawing us closer. The week before the wedding loomed like a storm cloud, the colors clashed so vividly with the black and white portrait of my future in-law's expectations. I couldn't sleep, the pink parasol and blush decorations filling every corner of my mind like quicksand. It was like a haunting chorus, and just before I drifted into a restless sleep, I found myself centered once more, a dreamlike image of walking down an aisle of happiness. All that mattered was our love and not the color of my dress. Then, on the day before the wedding, I received a message from my brother. Mom and Dad are fighting. It's bad. A wave of dread washed over me as I found myself torn between my loyalty to my family and my heart's desire. The chasm widened between my decisions, and on the fateful morning, I donned my pink dress alone in the hotel suite, my mother's disapproval echoing like a ghost trapped between and among all the swirling laughter of pre-wedding chaos. The sight of myself sent adrenaline rushing through my veins. I did look beautiful. As the ceremony began, however, I spotted Derek's family, shoulders rigid and jaws tight. My heart sank further with every step that carried me into their line of sight. Their eyes, void of understanding, chased away the joyful spark I had longed for. By the time we exchanged vows in front of our loved ones, I felt a churning pit of anxiety in my stomach. I wished for one person to embrace me and validate my choices, and yet I found only silence from my family's corner. The flush of embarrassment was invaded further, creeping in like vines on ancient stone. After the ceremony, as we danced surrounded by a bittersweet haze of joy and resentment, my grandmother confronted me about my foolhardiness. You won't honor tradition? On a day meant to bind your families. Her words were like shards of glass, and I fought the urge to scream. I tried to defend my actions, a flimsy paper boat riding the turbulent waves of emotion, and soon the reception spiraled into chaos. Derek's voice pierced through the crowd, a mix of frustration and disappointment mirrored in his eyes as I stood before my family and his, my pink dress like bandages on wounds that would never heal. The noise blurred into a cacophony of judgment and misunderstanding, laughter stained with unceremonious rejection, and in that moment, I felt a distinct fracture forming. The tension thickened so much that it became impossible to navigate. The phone rang, breaking the anguished silence that shifted our worlds into turmoil. My father, voice tremulous, came hurtling into the room. You need to come home. Now. Panic rose within me, as dread settled deep in my bones, an omen I couldn't escape. I thought about that pink dress, now drenched in symbolic blood. What was a celebration had become a battleground, leaving behind only the ruins of my dreams hanging like broken glass. When Derek saw the fear flashing in my eyes, he took my hand, pulling us away from their judging glares. "We'll make this right," he whispered, but I had no idea what that meant, whether our love could withstand the chaos we had unleashed. Yet a sliver of hope pierced through the shadows as we stepped beyond the threshold of acceptance and rejection, the pink fabric swirling around me, a whirlwind of sorrow and love intertwined. In those moments filled with disbelief, it became painfully clear that weddings shouldn't be a battlefield, yet here we found ourselves entrenched. Now a question ignited within: AITA for drama over a pink wedding dress? As I processed the fallout creeping into our lives, one thing was certain: it would take more than a color to define the love we were scrambling to salvage. Every year during summer break, my family and I head to our favorite lakeside cabin, a place marked by its tranquility and untouched beauty. It's always been a retreat from the chaos of life, but this last trip took a turn that still keeps me up at night. We arrived late on a Friday, just as a thunderstorm began to roll in, dark clouds brewing ominously over the mountains. My parents settled, and while I grabbed my backpack and headed to the rickety old pier, hoping to catch a moment of calm before the storm hit. As I stood staring out at the choppy water, I felt a presence beside me. I turned to see a girl, maybe a year or two younger than me, her auburn hair drenched by the rain, and her eyes wide as if she had somehow slipped into a different reality. Without a word, she motioned for me to follow her down the pier. Intrigued but slightly uneasy, I obeyed, as if bound by some invisible thread. She walked with a purpose until we reached the end, where the distance from land felt surreal, as if we were standing on the edge of the world. "You shouldn't be here," she whispered, her voice trembling. Just then, the sky split with a blinding flash of lightning, and I jumped, splashing into the murky water below. The last thing I remember was the girl's scream as I felt the cold envelop me, sinking deeper until everything went black. When I came to, I was gasping for air, my chest heaving as I clawed my way back to the surface. I looked around frantically for the girl, but there was no sign of her. It was as if she had vanished into thin air. I pulled myself onto the pier, soaked and terrified, but a part of me felt something I can only describe as wrong, a whispering dread that knotted in my stomach. I noticed the weather had gone eerily calm, the storm clouds dissipating as the sun peeked through the trees. Shivering, I hurried back to the cabin, brushing off my encounter as a strange dream. The next morning, the sun shone bright, but I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched as we went hiking along the scenic trails. It was there I overheard my parents casually talking about a little girl who had gone missing 2 summers ago, last seen near the lake. They said she had drowned, and with a chill, I wondered if this was the girl I had met. Later that evening, while my family played games inside, curiosity gnawed at me, and I slipped back down to the lake. The bright moon hung low in the sky, casting shimmering silvery light on the water, and I couldn't shake the feeling I was meant to be there. I called out, hoping to hear that girl's voice again, but only silence answered. Suddenly, I heard splashing, and then whispering. The whispers turned into chants as other shadows emerged from the woods. Their faces were obscured, and it felt like they were both there and not there. They pointed at me, demanding I join them in their fray, but I was rooted in place, paralyzed by fear. That girl appeared again, her face twisted in anguish, as if pleading for help, and I felt an uncontrollable impulse to step forward. But as I did, an unseen force pulled me back, and I resisted. That's when I heard it, a voice from the shadows, sickly and sweet, taunting, "You could save her, but it will cost you your joy." I couldn't understand, my heart racing as I felt the shadows drawing closer. Panic surged, and for reasons I still can't fully explain, I turned and ran, bolting back towards the safety of the cabin, my mind flooded with the realization that I could never return to the lake. The following day, my family checked out a bit earlier, perhaps sensing my distress. I kept having nightmares about that girl, about the shadows lingering by the lake. Days turned into weeks, and I convinced myself it was all just a figment of my imagination, a trick of the summer blues. But then came the phone call. It was a local news report about the lake. A girl had gone missing once again. She fit the same description as the girl from my summer. My heart dropped, and guilt washed over me, the kind that feels like a lead weight dragging you down. Could I have saved her? The thought gnawed at me, but deep down, the whispers in my head urged me to let it go, telling me I was being ridiculous. Still, I couldn't shake that eerie connection, feeling as if I had witnessed something I shouldn't have. My dreams grew darker, filled with shadows and whispers, and I wouldn't let myself swim anywhere near that lake again. As summer bled into fall, I tried to put it all behind me, but one night, while scrolling through social media, I came across a post that made my blood run cold, a photograph of that girl, smiling brightly, captioned, "Missing, please help us find her." Only this time, the comments were filled with those same shadowy figures from my dreams, claiming they could help, that they knew where she was. I barely slept that night, haunted by the thought that I had left her behind. And then, without warning, the shadows came back. They invaded every corner of my mind, filling my thoughts with despair and fear until the following summer rolled around, and my parents announced we'd be heading back to the cabin. My heart raced at the thought, and despite feeling unwell, I couldn't let my parents know. I had to face whatever darkness awaited me. When we arrived, everything seemed normal, no signs of the girl, just peace and quiet, the lake shimmering under a golden sunset. I convinced myself I was imagining it all until that very first night. I went for a walk along the pier and, as soon as I stepped onto the dock, I felt it, the cold breath on my neck and the whisper of a name, urging me forward. Ignoring every logical reason, I walked to the end of the pier, and there she was, emerging from the depths of the water, her pale face shimmering under the gathering moonlight, the shadows twisting around her sorrowful eyes. "Help me," she begged, her voice echoing across the water, and I felt my resolve crumble. I stepped closer, reaching my hand out, but that's when the shadows bubbled up, swallowing her whole as their whispers turned into a deafening roar. "You should have saved her," they cried, and I finally stumbled back, horrified beyond comprehension. My body felt frozen, my breath caught in my throat, as reality shattered. I dropped to the ground, overwhelmed by a flood of sorrow as my tears cascaded like rain. Suddenly, the girl emerged from the depths again, and she cried, but this time the sound pierced deep into my soul, ripping me apart, leaving me bare. "You let me drown," she screamed, her voice merging with the shadows. I felt like I was being tossed between worlds, lost in their twisted grasp. Finally breaking free from the haze, I turned and bolted back to the cabin, knowing that I could no longer live in denial. The next morning, I gathered my courage and confessed to my parents, hoping against hope they could help me understand, but they only looked at me with concern, brushing off my tales as a youthful imagination. They didn't understand what I had witnessed or felt, nobody ever did. Days went by, each one cementing the dread that had taken root in my heart, and when the time came for us to leave, I knew with clarity, I'd be forever haunted by that girl's anguish, an echo of guilt that would never fade. I boarded the car, every thought consumed by shadows, the whispers now entwined with my own thoughts, haunting me relentlessly. "You should have saved her," they taunted, their voices familiar yet alien, sending shivers down my spine, and as we drove away, I couldn't help but look back at the lake, the last vestiges of sunlight catching its surface, that eternal stillness reflecting a million stars above, and I screamed at the top of my lungs, a desperate plea to whatever forces lingered in the dark waters, "I am so sorry." But I knew then, it would never be enough to drown out the silence that followed. I never thought that allowing my mother to host Thanksgiving dinner at my house would lead to such chaos, but here we are, 3 days away from the holiday, and all I can think about is how I may have opened the door to something unspeakable. My wife, Sarah, is heavily pregnant with our 4th child and has been feeling exhausted and anxious, so I thought it would be a kind gesture to let my mother take over the cooking this year. She's been insisting on bringing her classic turkey and stuffing for as long as I can remember, and although my mother is eccentric, let's just say her ideas about food are unique, she promised she wouldn't do anything too outlandish this time. Since our first Thanksgiving together as a married couple, I've always felt the pressure of blending our families in the presence of holiday cheer, and Sarah has been under so much stress already. But as the day approaches, I've started to notice things that make my skin crawl. It began when my mother presented a package of what she claimed were secret spices for the turkey, each ingredient labeled with cryptic names. She explained they were traditional family recipes passed down for generations, but there was something eerie about the way her eyes sparkled when she mentioned them, like a wolf revealing its meal after a successful hunt. Sarah, noticing my discomfort, told me to ease up and let my mom have her fun, but late at night, when it was just the 3 of us and the kids were asleep, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was very wrong. I could hear my mother moving around the kitchen, testing her concoctions and humming strange lullabies that felt foreign, even menacing, in their melody. The scent of the spices wafting into the living room was strangely intoxicating, laced with an undertone that made me feel both dizzy and anxious, and every time I tried to confront her, she dismissed my concerns with a wave of her hand, claiming it was all in good spirit and for the family. It was around this same time that I found our youngest, Emma, talking to what she described as an invisible friend who made her giggle loudly at odd moments. Kids her age often have imaginary friends, but when I pried deeper, Emma's stories took on a bizarre, unsettling tone. He says Grandma's food is magic and that we're all invited to dinner, she'd say, her eyes wide with a mix of excitement and trepidation, as if she were caught between a dream and a nightmare. As Thanksgiving Day neared, my anxiety spiraled, and it didn't help that Sarah was increasingly sleepy and withdrawn, unable to shake what she described as a lingering fog in her mind. It was then that I went to look for my mother, only to find her hunched over the kitchen table, her fingers dripping with purple-red juices that I didn't want to think too hard about. "I'm just preparing the turkey, sweetie, don't worry," she said with an unsettling grin that stretched across her face, revealing crooked teeth that seemed to glisten with something unholy. I saw a glimpse of the turkey, its skin was unnaturally glossy, and there were an array of small, round wounds where the feathers had once lain, looking almost like a string of pearls encased in the fleshy, glistening skin. "Where did you get this?" I uttered, trying to keep my throat from constricting too tightly. My mother looked back at me, her expression shifting from affectionate to something feral, and though she didn't answer, the air in the room thickened with a kind of infectious dread. I stumbled backward, grappling with the chill creeping up my spine, convinced my mother was losing her mind. Before I could leave, she whispered, "They'll love it, they were waiting for you," and my heart raced painfully at the insinuation. It was without question a breaking point. I confronted Sarah, suggesting we uninvite my mother, but her response left me stunned. "Let her do this, please. I think I need it. I don't want to deal with anything else right now." I pestered her for weeks, but with that hint of desperation in her voice, I felt backed into a corner. Thanksgiving came, and the atmosphere was rife with tension. I attempted to remain composed as friends and family arrived, but a discomforting strain hung over us, a dark cloud shrouding the festivities. The food, glistening in all its macabre beauty, began to arrive, turkey adorned with crimson glimmers, sides overflowing with vibrant colors, the very air filled with an intoxicating sweetness that made my head spin. As we sat at the table, I eyed the kids, who eagerly hovered over the food, whispering secrets amongst one another, fueled by some silent pact I couldn't grasp. I watched in horror as they took their first bites, followed by delightful gasps and soft giggles, every forkful seeming to ignite their spirits to heights I'd never seen before, yet there was an edge of something primal in their delight. The adults, too, were transfixed, chatting joyfully as if no one else could sense the creeping chill between us, the hallucinations in the corners of visions that twisted laughter into darker sounds. My chest tightened as I felt my mother's gnarled fingers brush against my shoulder, and she leaned in to whisper, "They told me this day would come, that all would be well. Don't you see, this is how we keep the magic alive?" I felt ice coil around my heart, the ominous weight of her words settling deep within me. The moment Emma leaned across the table, her smile too wide, too predatory, to announce that Grandma's magic tastes so good. And my body began to betray me, the urge to scream battling against my instinct to protect. And then, just as quickly, I felt my resolve waver, almost collapsing under the deliciously dark enchantment that twisted through the air like invisible threads binding us all. That evening blurred between reality and terror, all of us trapped in a dreamscape where joy danced alongside malevolence. I realized with a jolt that the children were not simply enjoying a Thanksgiving feast, something dangerous was unfolding. Before I could act, the lights flickered, plunging us into shadows, and as confusion reigned, Sarah's voice echoed through the darkness, "We're all just pieces in her game," tinged with an eerie, knowing calmness, as if she were in on a secret knowing I could not comprehend. At that moment, I felt an exhilarating thrill of the macabre awakening deep inside, tearing at the ties of sanity as I become a spectator in this grotesque festival, watching my family become enraptured, my mother's soft laughter raking through the cracks of normality, as they surrendered to a feast that was anything but ordinary. I could hear a soft chant rise from the children, their words swirling like whispers carried on the wind, and that night, as darkness settled, I understood that I had failed my family. What I had thought to be a simple holiday dinner had turned into a horrifying rite, where every bite tightened the grip of something lurking, hungry, at the edges of my world, drawn in by a maternal force that would stop at nothing to ensure that this Thanksgiving would never end. I had always been a proud, open-minded person, but the moment my husband suggested hosting his niece and her friends for a weekend, my heart sank into my stomach like a stone. "They're just kids," he said when I expressed my discomfort. "It'll be fun." I smiled weakly, but a knot twisted in my gut as I remembered the incidents that had taken place in our small town recently, reports of children disappearing, strange eyes watching from the shadows, whispers that drifted across the playground late at night. It wasn't the kids themselves I disliked, it was the haunting feeling that something was terribly wrong. The first night they arrived, laughter filled our home, but it was an eerie kind of laughter, one that clawed at my insides. The kids immediately started playing hide and seek, but not under the usual terms. They seemed to forget the boundaries, darting into rooms we hadn't even entered yet, giggling and peeking out like they knew secrets we didn't. I felt like a ghost in my own house, stuck in a nightmare where I was simultaneously an unwilling host and an invisible observer. When they invited me to join their game, my skin prickled. I declined, saying I had work to do, but that only seemed to amuse them more. Their eyes glinted in the soft glow of the living room lamp, and every time they glanced my way, it felt as if they were sharing silent jokes I wasn't privy to, a joke at my expense. As night fell and I tried to tuck myself into bed, the sounds of their whispers drifted through the cracked walls of our old house. I could have sworn I heard my name amidst their giggles, calling me out as if it was a part of their secret game. The next day, I decided to take a bold step and talk to my husband, laying out my worries, hoping he would see the truth of the situation. "I just don't feel comfortable with them here, not with everything going on," I admitted, my heart racing as I spoke. He frowned, looking hurt, and I instantly regretted my honesty. "So you're saying our niece and her friends are a danger?" His voice was low and sharp like ice. I opened my mouth to explain, but the words felt too large for reality. He turned away, dismissing my fears as improbable paranoia. "You're overreacting," he said, and I knew that our disagreement would hang over us like a dark avalanche waiting to fall. Throughout the day, I became more determined to keep an eye on the children. I watched them from down the hall as they congregated around the dining room table, shadows flickering across their excited faces. They moved in coordinated precision, sharing odd words in a language I couldn't understand. Each time I stepped closer, they'd hush immediately, their eyes locking onto me with a strange intensity, as if I was intruding on something sacred. That night, I lay in bed, too restless to sleep, replaying my husband's skeptical reaction. Was I really being paranoid? The thought twisted my gut. I tried to focus on anything but the gnawing sensation lingering in my mind, but then a soft tapping snagged my attention. I swung my legs around and crept to the doorway. Peering into the darkened hallway, I felt the icy fingers of dread wrap around my spine. It was just past midnight, and the house was eerily silent except for the faint sound of laughter drifting in from the living room. Curiosity washed over me, enough to nudge my feet forward. I crept toward the voices, heart pounding, and when I reached the dining room, my heart nearly stopped. The children were gathered in a tight circle around something. What were they doing? I squinted, trying to see past their small, interlocked bodies. Suddenly, one of the boys glanced over his shoulder, catching my eye. An unsettling grin spread across his face, and he beckoned me closer. "Come join us," he chirped. Instinctively, I felt the air grow thick, pressing down on me like a heavy weight. "No," I called out, my voice trembling. "What are you doing?" A round of giggles erupted, and the girl standing in the center lifted something high above her head, something glinting in the dim light. My breath caught in my throat as I realized it was a stuffed animal, but it wasn't just any stuffed animal. Its fur was soaked, dripping an unnatural shade of red that pooled onto the floor. "Look!" another child exclaimed, excitedly pointing at the gory toy. "It's alive." My heart raced, and panic surged through my veins as I stumbled backward. They were all looking at me now, their expressions shifting from giddy playfulness to something dark, something twisted. The insistent tapping of their fists against the table echoed in the stillness, a morbid rhythm that sent chills shooting down my spine. "Wanna play?" the girl asked, her voice now too sweet, almost mocking. I turned and ran back to my room, locking the door, pressing my back against it as if it could shield me from whatever vile magic those children possessed. I tried to convince myself it was just a prank, but in the morning, the unease returned tenfold. As the sun rose, I slammed coffee into my system and finally confronted my husband again. "You need to see what they're doing. They're playing with something." "Wrong." His eyes narrowed in disbelief, but before he could respond, a raucous series of knocks shattered the morning calm. The children were outside, slamming their palms against the door, yelling my name, their voices rising to a pitch that felt like nails scraping against my skull. I opened the door to reveal them standing in a line, beaming smiles painted across their faces like they were in on a joke I wasn't. "We want to play," they chanted in unison, their voices ringing like a nauseating choir. My heart thudded painfully in my chest, and before I could reply, the boy in front pulled something from his pocket. It was a tattered piece of paper, and as he unfolded it, I recognized it all too well. "It's your name," he said, and my pulse quickened. It was an article written about the missing children of our town, my name marked at the bottom in a clumsy scrawl along with several others. "Join us in our secret, and you'll never want to leave," the girl chimed, and the invitation felt like a tether dragging me into an abyss. I slammed the door in their faces, trembling with anger and fear. My husband stormed in at that moment, demanding to know what was happening. I had never seen his face twisted with such concern. "Are you finally going to believe me?" I shouted, but he shook his head, his belief in me dwindling away like autumn leaves. I barricaded myself in our bedroom, praying, clutching my phone with trembling fingers, ready to call for help if it came to that, but I knew deep down that no one would believe me. The whispering began again, the shadows seemed to stretch further as I huddled against the closet door. Time blurred, and I didn't know how long I stayed there, locked in a never-ending spiral of fear, until I finally plucked up the courage to peek through the slightly ajar door. But the moment I did, an icy hand gripped my wrist, and those kids were there, back in my face, their smiles now wide and predatory, and they shifted like a sudden gust of wind as though they could melt right through the door. "You shouldn't have locked us out," the boy said, his voice echoing like distant thunder, and the last thing I remembered was screaming as the world crumbled into darkness around me, my consciousness slipping away as they slowly pulled me into their game. AITA for admitting I was uncomfortable. I now wondered, my voice echoing in the void, for there was no one left to hear me. My heart pounded in my chest like a drum as I stood at the edge of our yard, peering through the trees at the gathering across the street where my younger sister and her friends threw what they called a party. It wasn't the kind of party filled with balloons and cake, it was dark and chaotic, the flickering glow of a cheap disco light battling against the encroaching shadows of twilight. I had always been the responsible one, the one who stayed inside and studied while my sister, Mia, had been allowed to explore the edges of that reckless freedom. But as I listened to their laughter thick with smoke and heard the muffled beats of music that felt too loud for our suburban neighborhood, a knot of dread twisted in my stomach. When I accidentally overheard snippets of their conversations just a few nights before, a part of me wanted to look away, pretend I didn't hear them boast about sneaking out, drinking, and trying drugs, things I never thought Mia would dare to touch. But every time I thought about ignoring it, I pictured the way our mother would break if something happened to Mia, and the moral weight that pressed down on me was suffocating. I had to make a choice. So, I did what I thought was right, and I slipped through the door, my palms clammy against the cold brass knob, and I told our mother everything. At first, she didn't believe me, perhaps she couldn't bear to think that our sweet Mia, her golden child, could stoop to such depths. I led her to the window, hoping this time she would listen, and with each step toward that gathering, I felt the ground beneath me shift, the air growing heavy with anticipation for both of us. The moment she turned pale and I saw her fist clench, I knew I'd made the right choice. But the reality we stepped into was nothing short of catastrophic. Mia's laughter vanished into the night as Mom stormed over to where they were dancing, and I wished I could feel as invincible as they seemed. When Mom confronted her friends, I watched the chaos unfold, their innocence bled away, replaced by guilt, as they scattered like skittles dropped on asphalt. Mia, shattered and furious, faced our mother the way a wild animal afraid for its life might confront a hunter. What followed was a symphony of screaming that rattled the very windows, a confrontation that carved itself into the fabric of our family. My sister was kicked out of the house that night, a decision permeated with shame playing across my mother's face like a veil. The last time I saw Mia, she stood at the door, eyes locked onto mine, and I dared not look away. Could I, the one who had always protected her, really be the monster who caused all this? Was I, in fact, an awful person for looking out for her? Guilt ate at me for days following the incident, but there was also a creeping sense of fear lingering in the corners of my mind. As the days melted into weeks, Mia's absence turned our home into a hollow shell. Our mother's grief manifested in silence, each meal a reminder of the laughter that once filled the air. I received mixed messages from everyone. Friends at school whispered their pity while my teachers offered me haunting looks that spoke volumes, as if they miraculously knew my hand in the fray. I thought about reaching out to Mia, but the shame rooted me in place, tightening every nerve and leaving me wondering if I had made a dreadful mistake. One night, when I couldn't bear the haunting guilt any longer, I decided to text Mia, an olive branch, a feeble apology hidden behind layers of regret. But instead of the expected "I miss you" or "I understand," she simply replied, "You have no idea what you've done." Those words slashed through my chest. I half expected a sob fest but instead got cold dread that coiled within me. For weeks, I left my phone on my bed, too frightened to reach out again, until one day when I received an unexpected voicemail. "You'll pay for this," she snarled, her voice dripping with malice, warped and unrecognizable. From that moment on, the atmosphere shifted. I felt eyes on me, shadows lurking just behind my shoulders. I could hear the whisper of Mia's name on the wind whenever I walked to school, could sense the malicious energy in the air that followed me home. I found myself glancing over my shoulder, heart racing, convinced Mia had turned into something more sinister, a specter lurking just beyond my vision, waiting for the right moment to pounce. Then, the knocks started, quiet at first but building into furious strikes that made me jump. Each time I opened the door, my heart would leap, praying it was merely a neighbor or the pizza delivery guy, but always hoping to see her face, until one evening, it was my mother who answered the door, forcing a grin, sagging under the weight of her grief. That night, the silence deepened, a heavy blanket pressing over our home, and I could swear I heard Mia's laughter echoing off the walls in the dead of night. The weeks dragged on, my anxiety spiraled, until I could no longer tell when I was awake or dreaming. Then came the night of terror, an unspeakable thing that broke through the stillness of our home. It awakened me from a restless sleep, a piercing shriek echoing like steel scraping against stone. I bolted up, breath hitched in my throat, heart pounding as I grabbed my phone, praying it wasn't Mia, that she hadn't returned to exact her revenge. I opened the door a crack, shadows danced under the moonlight, and creeping dread slid into my bones. As I stepped into the hallway, the familiar scent of smoke clawed at my throat, reminding me of those forgotten nights by the tree across the street. What I found at the end was nothing I could have ever imagined. Mia stood there, features twisted in rage, surrounded by her friends, an odd gathering that felt both foreign and familiar in a way I couldn't comprehend. Except now, they wore masks, faces twisted in grotesque expressions, and when they turned to me, the air filled with chilling laughter that echoed my wildest fears, inhuman, mocking. "You should have left us alone," Mia hissed, her voice slipping through the masks of her friends, haunting and venomous. I tried to back away, but a force pulled me forward, chaotic energy bubbling in the air, vibrating through my bones, my heart racing in fear. "What do you want?" I stammered, but the swirling laughter grew louder, drowning out my voice and whispering, "It's your fault, you wanted this." In that moment, I realized the truth planted firmly in the pit of my stomach. I didn't just lose my sister that night, I had lost myself as well. The love I thought could conquer all had twisted into something malevolent, and I was left in a game I never volunteered to play. As the laughter soared, crescendoing into a feral din that shattered the walls of my sanity, frantic thoughts raced through my mind. Were they all just figments of my imagination? But the unmistakable truth clamped around my throat like a vice. I had brought this darkness upon both our lives. I could hear them chanting, words that stole the warmth from my soul, and at that moment, I understood their true nature. They were no longer just me as friends, they were something darker, something that thrived in the shadows I had feared all along. I collapsed to my knees, the weight of regret and despair suffocating, and there, in the dim light of the hallway, I realized not just who Mia had become, but also who I had become, a puppet on strings of guilt. As the laughter enveloped me, each teasing taunt whispered back memories of warmth, love, and laughter, replaced now by darkness, echoing indefinitely against the walls of our broken home. In that moment of clarity, I knew it was too late to save her, and too late to save myself. When my husband, Mark, met Tyler at the gym, I thought it was harmless. I was glad to see him making a new friend after years of long nights working his sales job. But as their friendship blossomed, spontaneous workouts, late-night phone calls, and weekend outings, I couldn't shake the feeling that I had become a ghost in my own home, a specter hovering over what used to be our strong family unit, especially as our family tradition of Sunday dinners began to wither like a neglected plant. It felt foreign, like watching someone else take my place at the head of the table where we once laughed and shared stories. I tried to be supportive, reminding him of our Sunday gatherings that had anchored us through both good and bad times, but each time I brought it up, he brushed me off with a half-hearted, "We can do it next week." Weeks turned into months, and soon we were only eating dinner together when he was too tired to go out with Tyler. My frustration turned into resentment. I tried confronting him, but every time I mentioned how much our tradition meant to me, Mark threw in an eye roll as if I were an old-fashioned relic, stuck in a past he had outgrown. The Sundays I had cherished turned into silent nights filled with cold pasta and leftover memories, and though I hoped he would see how much I was suffering, it felt like I was speaking into a void. That's when everything changed. Tyler invited us out to a fancy restaurant downtown, and Mark, without checking with me, enthusiastically accepted, trying to mask the guilt beneath his excitement. I had reached a tipping point by then. The idea of my family tradition being outclassed by what I saw as a fleeting friendship snapped something inside me. I told Mark, absolutely desperate for his attention, that I wanted him to prioritize our family traditions over this new friendship, but instead of seeing my pain, he exploded in frustration, accusing me of being controlling and jealous of his friendships, hurling words like selfish and old-fashioned at me like daggers. On that fateful Sunday, when he chose to go out with Tyler instead of coming home for the traditional meal we'd wrestled to prepare together, I felt an icy grip clench around my heart. Alone in the kitchen, I meticulously set the table for a family that no longer existed in the way I longed for it to. When the clock ticked past the hour we would typically start eating, shadowy memories whipped around me, our kids giggling as they waged food fights, Mark's booming laugh filling the air, the sweet smell of garlic bread wafting through the house as though it were the very essence of our shared life. Then, as if on cue, a knock echoed through the silence, startling me. When I answered, I was met not with Mark and his sly smirk but with Tyler, who wore an expression of shame and good intention that I couldn't quite place. He stood there, holding a large bouquet of lifeless flowers and an empty food container marked takeout. Ty. I felt a rush of emotions crash inside me. Anger, confusion, and a deep sorrow riveted my resolve, but before I could identify one coherent thought, he started to speak. Mark had this at the restaurant, told me he'd be home soon, but... He trailed off, looking remorseful while guilt oozed from his body like sweat after a long workout. And just like that, I realized that I was not just losing Mark but all the warmth the family held had crumbled like decaying leaves. Tyler's voice trembled as he said, "He wanted to keep going with our friendship, but I didn't know you were feeling this way when I invited him." With Tyler standing there, I felt every sunbeam of hope vanish, the air thickening with unspoken truths. He didn't even understand. How could he? Mark had grown so entranced by this new life that the shadows of our past had intruded upon my very soul. When I finally raised my voice, I felt emboldened, accusing them both of neglect and disrespect. You think friendship's easy, but family is built on something deeper. It's respect, loyalty, and moments shared over years. You can't just glamorize a flicker and let it drown out a flame, I shouted, voice cracking, losing its strength as Tyler seemed to shrink before me, a boy caught in the crossfire of a battle he never wanted to join. "I just wanted him to have fun," he muttered, eyes cast downward. "I didn't mean to hurt you." I felt a torrent of emotions bubble inside me. Deep down, I knew Tyler was merely a conduit for a chasm that had formed between Mark and me, rooted in neglect and bitterness. Suddenly, the door swung open, and Mark stepped in, laughter echoing against the walls, jangling like bells on a frayed wire. He paused, taking in the sight before him, me, standing defensively, Tyler looking about ready to fold in on himself, and suddenly it struck me that I had become the villain in this narrative. "What's going on?" Mark asked, the laughter draining from his voice. I stood there, trembling, feeling immeasurable anger but also a pang of desperation as I fought to find the right words. "Mark, you're losing us." The syllables formed a shaky confession laden with heartache, and it was as if the room began to tilt, shadows shifting ominously as the truth of my pain spilled out into the open air. In that agonizing moment, vulnerability consumed me, and I saw Mark's face crack open, confusion swirling with realization. Could we claw our way back to the shared memories we used to laugh about like old friends? Could he embrace our tradition instead of dismissing it for something ephemeral? Silence fell heavy between us, and I knew we were all standing precariously on the edge of a broken promise, one thread still connecting us to the flaking facade of our home life, closely adhered to a memory that was slowly being eroded by the tide of indifference. I used to think conflicts in marriage were easy to resolve. After all, how hard could it be to express your feelings about something that's bothering you? But that was before the Fruit Loops incident, the night everything changed between my husband Eric and me. It began innocently enough. I was exhausted after a long day at work, and as I shuffled into the kitchen, I spotted Eric happily indulging in a massive bowl of cereal, the artfully vibrant loop smothered in milk, his face illuminated by the glow of the fridge light. I greeted him with a smile, expecting just a quiet moment to connect after a hectic day, but the atmosphere soured when I saw he already had a second bowl prepared, as if realizing he'd need it to satiate some insatiable hunger I didn't even know he had. My initial amusement turned to annoyance as he spooned a heaping helping into his mouth, the sound of the cereal crunching echoing in the dimly lit kitchen, like a cruel remix of my own spiraling frustration. "Are you really going to eat that much?" I asked, trying to inject a hint of humor into my comment, but Eric shot me a glare that poured ice down my spine. "What? It's just cereal," he replied, voice tinged with defensiveness as if I'd accused him of committing heinous acts. It struck me that maybe, just maybe, I was overreacting, so I shrugged it off and made myself a much smaller bowl, but the unease lingered like a ghost I couldn't shake. I sat across from him, and we could barely look at each other as the silence stretched, punctuated only by the clinking of spoons and slurping milk, hollow reminders of our widening disconnect. Trying to break the suffocating tension, I suggested we talk about our days, sharing a story about a coworker's mishap that had everyone in stitches, but Eric nodded in response, his focus unwavering from the bowl as if I were speaking an entirely different language. I could feel rage bubbling beneath my skin, a helplessness morphing into something primal, and I couldn't help but feel he was deliberately ignoring me. Finally, in a moment of clarity wrapped in a shroud of frustration, I blurted out, "It's kind of selfish to hog all the cereal, you know." Silence ensued. Eric's spoon clattered against the bowl, the sound sending a shockwave through my chest. "Selfish? You think eating a bowl of cereal makes me selfish?" he asked incredulously, his voice rising, anger twisting his features into something I almost didn't recognize. I was tired. "Just because I want to enjoy my food doesn't mean I'm putting myself before you." The atmosphere became thick with unsaid words. I felt a reservoir of tears threaten to spill over, and I wasn't sure why I felt so shut out. My unease blossomed into outright confusion because it was just cereal, wasn't it? What did it even mean when we hurled accusations back and forth like cold cuts at a deli, the oddity of the situation spiraling toward an absurd conclusion? "You're making a big deal out of nothing, Eric," spat, indignant, and for a fleeting second, his ire glanced off my armor of hurt. Perhaps I was making a mountain out of a molehill. But then came a wave of bitterness that I couldn't ignore. Wasn't this about more than Fruit Loops? It was about our relationship, the chasm that had grown between us, countless nights of silence more poignant than words, several missed connections disguised as life's daily grind. I felt utterly alone in my desire to bridge that gap, a rhythmic pulse pounding in my ears as he continued to scoff at my words, chewing through each syllable as if they were the very cereal he deemed more important than our conversation. The bowl became a battleground as I accused him of being neglectful, focusing on superficial things instead of the underlying issues that screamed for attention. "If I can't even talk to you about our basic needs, who am I to share my life with you?" I felt raw, exposed, like a creature caught in the harsh light of his casual apathy, but he refused to budge, scoffing as he dug into another helping, the brightly colored pieces swimming in milk, blissfully unaware of the maelstrom of emotions swirling just a few inches away. I got up, slammed my bowl in the sink, and stomped toward our bedroom, where the weight of my words loomed over me. I slumped against the door, trying to catch my breath as I felt the tears tumble down my cheeks. Am I the entitled one here? The nagging voice inside me echoed as guilt washed over like a tidal wave. But rather than reflecting on my own pain, I wondered if he could truly remain indifferent while the world burned around him. This was more than cereal. It was the way he could eat so blithely while ignoring the hollow sounds of our lives barely touched by intimacy. Hours passed, my thoughts spiraled until they felt tangible, raw like a wound, and when I heard the soft patter of his footsteps creeping toward our bedroom, I thought maybe we could reconcile. But instead, Eric stood at the threshold, and before I could even summon a calm demeanor, he mumbled something unintelligible that sounded much like an apology but felt entirely hollow, just a way to end the night without earnestness. I could see it in the way he avoided eye contact, shame shimmering briefly only to collapse under the weight of his pride. I muttered something back, words soaked in resentment, and, in that moment, in that oh-so-ordinary kitchen illuminated with memories and the smell of fading milk, I realized this dinner was more than a bowl of cereal. It had come to symbolize everything gnawing at us beneath the surface, the inability to dig deeper, the hesitance to face what was truly wrong. I lay on the bed, staring at the ceiling, allowing exhaustion to wash over me, yet sleep eluded as I replayed the events of the night like a reel in slow motion. In that ache of solitude, I understood something crucial. It wasn't about cereal anymore, it was about feeling unseen. The next morning was a chilly void of unspoken words. You could cut the tension with a knife as neither of us acknowledged what had transpired. Eric settled back into his routine, stepping lightly with precise purpose, brewing coffee while I poured cereal, determining to trudge forward despite the weight of resentment. Should I have bitten my tongue? Should I have just let him indulge? But beneath that question lurked a deeper one: was I wrong for wanting recognition? Days turned into weeks, and while practical matters continued as they always did, I felt the shift, how we danced around each other more carefully, like two actors performing in a play where the audience was unaware of the tension building offstage. I found solace in the quiet of night when I could replay our childish skirmish, flesh and blood memories tinged with bitterness, wondering if we were just prolonging the inevitable, forcing ourselves through to the end of a dull script. And then, one evening, as I flicked through Netflix in a desperate bid to create a new shared experience, I offered to make dinner. Maybe my gesture would be perceived as an olive branch. But after gathering ingredients and cooking a meal for two, I hesitantly beckoned Eric to our table, fiery lights dancing against the walls, and proposed we eat together instead of watching another episode without so much as a glance or a word exchanged. He looked up, reluctance flickering across his face as he joined me, but the table was a quiet battlefield once again, simmering words lingering in the corners of our postures. I couldn't hold back the flood anymore, all those hidden truths threatening to explode, the silence we'd sustained too long wrapped around our throats. "You know, I called you selfish for a reason because you're not the only one hurting here," I said, heart racing, pouring out my frustration, and finally giving way to the aching loneliness I felt. His brow furrowed as if I had disturbed some old, long-buried pain. When he finally spoke, it was in a whisper laced with vulnerability. "I didn't mean to shut you out. I thought Fruit Loops would fill a void. I didn't realize I had created another." In that moment, I understood what we'd both been trying to stave off: the hurt, the apathy, the mounting discontent. But what terrified me more than the fight over a bowl of cereal was the recognition that maybe the things we felt compelled to fight over were only reflections of the storms brewing beneath the surface. And that night, instead of cereal becoming our destruction, it transformed into something unexpected, an offering of understanding, a chance to heal the wounds left festering in the shadows. We each took a slice of the truth, and through the darkness, the glow of hope started to dance in the periphery, a tiny flicker promising that even the smallest battles could become the beginning of something new. And as we sat there, spooning in unison, I realized sometimes it takes a bowl of cereal to really see each other again. Every Thanksgiving, I felt obligated to attend my aunt's annual dinner, a tradition that started before I was even born, but this year felt different, almost oppressive. It was a routine gathering embellished with family feuds and stories of past mischief, but a thick air of something ominous clung to the dining room. As we sat down, the scent of roasted turkey mingled with something disconcertingly sour, a smell I could not quite place. My eyes landed on the side dish Aunt Helen had brought, a massive casserole of what she called Thanksgiving surprise. Something about its texture, the way it glistened under the dining room lights, made my stomach churn. It looked almost like it had been reheated, the edges crisped just enough to hint it might have spent more than a few days in her fridge, or maybe worse, her basement. It wouldn't be the first time I had suspicions about Aunt Helen's cooking. Last year, I remembered swallowing dry turkey while she told me about her magic spice she sprinkled in everything, but nothing that magical came to mind when I examined her last-minute concoction. She caught me looking, her eyes narrowing, and suddenly a wave of guilt washed over me. "You're not going to try my special dish?" she asked. The way she said it felt almost like a challenge, and I felt trapped in the moment, everyone staring expectantly, utensils poised, ready to dive into their plates like eager wolves. I hesitated, a million thoughts colliding in my mind, the family outcast for not trying Aunt Helen's cooking versus potential illness. Instead of answering, I politely said, "I'm full." My lie hung in the air like the sweet potato casserole quietly baking in the oven, and for a moment, you could feel a collective shift in the atmosphere, a tightening of bonds that were already fraying, an unseen weight pressing down on us all. Aunt Helen laughed, but it wasn't a real laugh. It echoed strangely in the room, tinged with something unsettling. "Oh, sweetie, there's always room for family," she insisted as she scooped a heaping spoonful onto my plate anyway. I could feel my face flush, the need to say no battled by the pressure of familial obligation. My heart raced as I pushed the plate away, a plea to my mom for help dancing in my eyes. She merely shrugged, seemingly lost in her own food coma, and Aunt Helen's vibe shifted to something predatory. I was suddenly acutely aware that I couldn't remember the last time I'd seen her cooking, the dish itself looking far too stale, too out of place, and an echo of horror rose up within me. She had a reputation for experimenting, especially with her more unconventional recipes. Trusting my instincts, I politely declined once more, repeating my mantra about being full, yet Aunt Helen leaned closer, her voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper, "You know you can't not eat it. It's special, like our family." A chill ran down my spine, a clear implication that unwillingness wasn't merely an option. My plate, sitting there, so innocently menacing, suddenly became a focal point of dread, and I could feel the eyes of my relatives on me, their longing to see tradition upheld clashing with my rising panic. The moments stretched on indefinitely, Aunt Helen's expression morphing from a faux sweet smile to something that sent a tremor through my spirit, a frown laced with unyielding expectation and a hint of malice. Somewhere deep inside, I felt her frustration swirling like a storm, and I suddenly remembered stories, whispers, that Aunt Helen had experimented with unusual ingredients before, substances that could only be described as unique, maybe even dangerous. In a moment of clarity, I could imagine the casserole magically becoming the centerpiece of her questionable culinary adventures. Perhaps she had unearthed a recipe passed down through the generations, one made with something far too bizarre to be served at a standard family gathering. My stomach turned again as the fear bubbled over. I couldn't shake the image of her examining her creation in her dimly lit kitchen, the sounds of her cackling laughter dancing with the phantom memories of the dishes I had once consumed, turning sour and abandoned long before Thanksgiving. The tension broke only when my cousin Joey made a joke that landed flat, but the deflection only caused Aunt Helen to fissure. The silence grew loud and thick with unspoken words and unresolved emotions until she snapped, "You'll eat it. It's not Thanksgiving without my special dish." With each insistence, I could feel the pull of tradition choking me like a stranglehold, gnawing at my resolve, pipes of familial loyalty clinging to me as if refusing to let go. I felt the eyes of relatives proclaiming judgment, silently questioning if I would survive another year without indulging Aunt Helen's craving for pressuring me to devour it. One bite, I convinced myself, just one. Finally, I mustered some courage, my hand trembling as it reached for the serving spoon, and then I froze, caught mid-movement, my imagination racing ahead, scripting the silent horror play of what could happen if I surrendered. For what if the dish was made of despair? What if I, too, fell prey to the ancient recipe, consumed by whatever vile secrets lay within? "Aunt Helen, I just can't," I finally stammered, glimpsing the anger surging in her eyes before I reluctantly blurted out the truths I had bottled up. "I can't eat things that have been sitting around. What if it's bad?" The room went deathly quiet, tension crackling like electric current. Aunt Helen's face morphed from frustration to an eerie calm, a chilling smile stretching across her features. "Oh, sweetie," she cooed, and I think I detected a touch of satisfaction beneath that sugar-coated voice. "You have no idea what's good for you, do you? This recipe is an heirloom passed down through generations, a commitment of love and sacrifice." In my gut, dread swirled with pure terror as the world fell away, Aunt Helen morphing into an almost fiendish apparition desperate for me to partake in her eerie legacy. The air surrounded me felt apparent with sinister undertone, and every muscle in my body screamed to get away from that table as I heard the whispers of cousins muttering behind me, "Are you really going to challenge her? Family comes first." Just as I opened my mouth to scream, the lights flickered, and a horrible realization washed over me. They all seemed to be bound to this sick ritual, a cycle fueled by hidden secrets and untold sacrifices. Then Aunt Helen continued, her voice low and almost seductive, "You think we're all just here for the food, don't you? But it's the dish that binds us, keeps our family together through everything, including those who, let's say, didn't make it to the end of the feast last year." A cold shiver crawled up my spine, and a sickening clarity washed over me, a dark understanding fretting at my sanity as I envisioned an empty chair at the table, last year's dinner where a cousin had simply vanished. Was it possible that something more sinister was cooking beneath that surface? The thought propelled me to my feet, my stomach rebelling against me in scathing protest. I can't, I screeched, the words pouring out of me like molten lava. I refuse. I bolted for the door as Aunt Helen's chilling laughter echoed behind me, a sound I was convinced would haunt me forever. I rushed outside, my breath leaving me in sharp gasps and my mind racing, picturing the plate of Thanksgiving surprise, the voiceless screams it held, the lingering stench of something rotten that tainted not just the casserole but maybe everything about our family. I knew, without a doubt, that I couldn't turn back, couldn't be ensnared in whatever dark web Aunt Helen had woven, and I'd sooner fast until Christmas than find out just how far she would go to preserve her twisted legacy. I stumbled into the night, knowing I would be the family outcast in their eyes, but anything was better than feasting on the horrors of last year. As the darkness closed in around me, a thrill of freedom coursed through my veins, and yet, a lingering question remained: would I be the one uninvited next year, or would the casserole have its appetite satisfied before another Thanksgiving crept upon us? I never thought my life would take the turn it did that fateful evening when I decided to clear out our daughter's bedroom. I stood in the doorway, heart racing, staring at the colorful walls plastered with unicorn stickers that she loved so much, a room frozen in her laughter and brightness, but now haunted by my husband's betrayal, a betrayal I had stumbled upon just weeks before, his late-night texts, his reckless disregard for our family, and the undeniable evidence of an affair that birthed a child they never intended for me to know. But I knew everything. Still, those long sleepless nights consisted of perfecting my revenge, and the twisted sense of justice motivated me to pack up her life as if I was merely returning a borrowed possession to a long-lost friend. I remembered the day she was born, how I had cradled her tiny body in my arms, promising her eternal love and protection, and suddenly, I felt this primal urge to shield her from the disgrace of her father's actions, and so that night, I made the trek to the attic and retrieved the boxes marked with her name, stuffed animals, art supplies, those crayon-drawn pictures that once adorned our fridge, items that brought joy now felt like reminders of her father's betrayal. I marched to her room, emptying shelves, packing them meticulously, as if with every toy I stuffed into the box I could erase the memories of his infidelity, feelings of rage coursing through my veins as I imagined his other child, the one from the affair, unpacking her things in my sacred space, living a life in our home where my daughter's spirit once thrived. How dare he think he could bring that child into our world as though nothing had changed? I loaded my car with the boxes that night, my heart pounding, the weight of my decision clinging to my chest. The thought of her father coming home to find nothing but stark walls staring back at him was too delicious to resist. I drove to my parents' house, a place where I had grown up, their cozy warmth suffocating me in nostalgia as I lugged in the boxes, determined to secure a part of my daughter's happiness where no one could touch it, wrapping it in the safe confines of love, and calling my parents to let them know the crazy plan I was enacting. They were concerned but ultimately supportive, especially after hearing the tremor of betrayal in my voice, the elements of sadness seeping through the cracks of my resolve. The weeks that followed were restless, amplifying my anxiety when I finally decided to confront him. His apologies rang hollow as he described how life just happened, and the words tore through me, shattered glass echoing in the vacant spaces of my heart. I could feel the cracks form as he pleaded with me to just give everything a second chance, to welcome him back into my arms and our daughter's life, an opportunity I knew I could never grant. Instead, I threw the boxes down around him, each one thudding against the floor with the weight of our broken dreams, hexing him with my furious stare. I told him I'd already done the heavy lifting. He would have nothing left of her, nothing left of peace for the child that had stolen my life. He gasped, his face morphing into disbelief, anger bubbling within those hazel eyes I once loved. But I felt a strange sense of satisfaction as I hung up the phone after declaring it was done, a calm overtaking me as I drove back to my parents' place to tuck my daughter into bed. And the next day, I received a call that turned my world further upside down. A mixture of disdain and pity filled my stomach as I learned about his plans to contest the arrangement, claiming that I was being unreasonable, uprooting her life further into chaos, twisting my act as malice rather than a mother's attempt to protect the sanctity that remained of our family. A loaded gun and a duel awaited. The stakes were high as whispers of the affair child began surfacing. Drama unfolding in circles I never intended to find myself in, my small town filled with scrutiny and judgment as I became the center of attention. The child was so innocent, I understood, but the way my husband was telling the story twisted everything about who I was. I was the villain now, the sinner who sought revenge on a child who knew nothing, and yet, I was right. It was an emotional roller coaster that left my heart wearied and precariously balanced as I battled courts for custody, justified my choices in front of their distorted glares, and braced for the war that would ensue ensue when the affair child's mother decided to step forward, her blood-curdling screams echoing in the depths of my mind when she confronted me about taking their belongings, accusing me of silently cruel intentions as if I was the one who betrayed, as if I pulled the trigger first. It was easy to hate her as she bounced behind the emotions of being denied happiness, as I reminded myself she chose this life, while I had committed to ours. But things began to change when I heard my daughter whisper hauntedly through the air while she played with friends, "Is my room still there?" Maybe the futility of my actions were now painful in ways I hadn't anticipated as I realized I wasn't only uprooting my husband and the child he sired, but I was silently ripping apart my little girl's foundation, and that thought dug in. So a week passed, and I stood at my former home, staring at the pallid door, and my heart cracked open even wider. I bellowed open the front door, the darkness of the hallway overwhelmed me, and there it was, that echo of laughter carried down the walls, but no longer were they filled with her joy. My heart raced as I ventured past the living room to vanish into my daughter's realm of colors, and in that instant, I felt like a ghost. The furniture moved around so starkly it was as if I could feel nothing but despair seeping through the cracks, and what awaited was a mere glimpse of those toys that I had left behind. They remained discarded, callously tossed without care, and the sheer thought of my daughter being replaced by a child who should have never existed in this place stirred something inside me. It hit me then, I wasn't making a point, I was simply hurting an innocent. I never thought I'd be the one to ruin the holidays, but I guess that's what happens when your family decides you're the villain. It all started when Mom began to forget things, small things at first, like where she placed her knitting needles, but soon it escalated to missing important appointments and repeating stories just minutes apart. By the time the doctors finally agreed it was Alzheimer's, we were already deep into the annual holiday preparations, every single corner of the house smelling like cinnamon and pine, a stark contrast to the dread that settled in my stomach. My siblings and I had been discussing Mom's care for months, but every time we brought it up, Dad would brush us off, insisting she was just going through a phase. So, there we stood at the kitchen table that year, stuffing our faces with sugar cookies, debating the reality in front of us while Dad played Christmas music a little too loud to ignore the seriousness of the conversation. We finally decided it was time to take action. My sister and I felt like we had no choice but to push Dad to consider a long-term care facility, a decision that would forever alter the dynamics of our family. After weeks of pushing and arguing, we managed to find a place, one that seemed warm and welcoming, tucked away near a lovely, serene park. I'll never forget the look on Mom's face the day I took her there. It was a mix of confusion and unease, like she was suddenly stuck in a world unfamiliar to her. Sure, there were moments that broke my heart, when I heard her mumble under her breath about wanting to go home, or the way her hands trembled as she reached out for mine while we were walking through the facility's garden. Still, I convinced myself that it was the best decision for her. I didn't realize how my family would react until the holidays arrived. We gathered around the dinner table, laughter bouncing off the walls like the spirited carols playing in the background, but every joke fell flat when someone brought up Mom being in the facility. The looks exchanged, disapproving, hurt, cut deeper than any knife could. "You had to put her in there, huh?" My brother scoffed, mimicking the tone of someone relaying gossip, making a joke out of something that felt raw and broken. I asked him how he thought we could keep up with her needs when we could barely manage our own lives, and in response, he slammed his fists on the table, sending a glass of wine flying off the edge for it to shatter against the floor, the sound echoing in my ears like a tolling bell. Christmas night turned into a disaster. Dad left the table early, mumbling something about being sick, and my brother followed him, grumbling about how things used to be. My sister sat there, seemingly unaffected, but I could see the tears threatening to spill. I felt like I had placed a rift in our family's foundation, and it was my fault. By the time the clock struck midnight, I was alone in the kitchen, scrubbing the remnants of that holiday meal, staring at my reflection in the darkened window. It was surreal watching myself shift from a devoted daughter into some distorted version attacking her own flesh and blood. That's when I heard it, soft, muffled whispers drifting from the living room where my family was gathered. Curiosity piqued, I leaned against the wall, straining to hear their words as well as the melancholy sound of the music filtering through the air. "I miss Mom, she was the glue," my sister said, her voice thick with emotion. "This isn't the way it's supposed to be." I stood frozen, panic swelling inside until I couldn't suppress it any longer. I was about to turn away when I heard my brother's voice, low and menacing, cutting through the sorrow. "She wrecked Christmas. We'll never forgive her." His words stung, and the darkness began to swell, an ugly, gnawing sensation crawling along my spine. For weeks after, all I heard from my siblings were passive-aggressive remarks about how I was to blame. They'd thrown holiday gatherings minus me, told stories that excluded any mention of Mom's current state, effectively rewriting history to make it look as though I wasn't even a part of this family anymore. I could have handled that, dealt with their hostility, but what I couldn't prepare for was that one icy January night a blizzard hit, forcing them to call me. Mom had fallen and needed to be rushed to the hospital. I couldn't breathe as I drove through the blinding snow, my heart racing faster than my car skidding across the icy roads. Arriving at the hospital, I was met with a wall of tension. My brother stood at the entrance, shoved his hands deep into his pockets, avoiding any eye contact, while my sister's eyes were red-rimmed and puffy, the stress and guilt weighing down on all of us. When the doctor finally emerged with a grim expression, it became painfully clear, I'd made the worst decision of my life. Mom had pneumonia. The long-term care facility had been negligent, failing to monitor her properly, allowing her state to worsen while we sat at home, too caught up in our family drama to notice. Standing in the stark waiting room, all the blame came crashing down on me like an avalanche. I was the villain in this warped version of our holiday story, and now, I held the key to her life in my hands. Days stretched into an eternity, and every minute was filled with tension. My siblings and I watched her fight for breath, whispering stories of how she used to bake cornbread on chilly afternoons or read us bedtime stories until we nodded off, hoping that somehow reaching into a happy past might bring back the woman we loved. Then, in a moment that felt both exhilarating and terrifying, her eyes opened briefly, and for a fleeting second, I swear I saw the spark of recognition, a glimmer of the warm, loving mom I had known slowly fading. But just as quickly as it appeared, it vanished, her breath becoming shallow as our family crumbled around her. A few weeks later, Mom was discharged, but she was not the same, lost in a fog of confusion and fear, like a wisp of smoke dissolving into the air. We decided to take her home, feeling that maybe familiarity would assist her recovery. As we settled into a grim routine, the guilt twisted deeper, roughening our laughter, suffocating our joy, and turning family moments into reminders of what we lost that fateful day I made an impossible choice. If anything good emerged from our turmoil, it was that my siblings and I finally united under an unspoken oath to never let the past repeat itself. We'd always check in on one another, foregoing the blame and the name-calling in the spirit of family. Yet the shadow of that holiday still hung over me, unrelenting and bitter, a chilling reminder of how a seemingly small decision, placing my mom in a facility, had led to our family's unraveling. We may not fully understand our roles in the eulogy of what once was, but I know one thing for certain: the holidays became unbearable, each year a haunting reminder of lost moments, with our lingering guilt festering into a dangerous concoction of shared grief and blame that can either bind us together or tear us apart all over again. So now, as I sit here, secretly shaking and desperately holding on to the hope that we can find a way back to some semblance of love and happiness, I question, am I the asshole for wanting to reclaim my family during this holiday season, or am I just a prisoner to my own mistakes, forever banished from the warmth that was once our reality? I'm writing this because I'm terrified, and I need to share my story before it consumes me. It all started innocently enough. My mother-in-law, Diane, was a well-meaning woman, or at least, that's what I kept telling myself in the years we spent feigning cordiality while navigating her unpredictable rages. A few weeks before her death, when she was confined to a hospital bed after a sudden heart attack, she let slip her plans for her will. We sat there, my husband and I, sipping weak coffee in that sterile waiting room, our expressions shifting from bored to tense as she rambled on about the 5 timeshares she insisted were a gift from the heart. 5 timeshares, 1 in the Bahamas, 2 in the Smoky Mountains, and 2 in Oregon, all racking up an eye-watering total of $9,500 in annual fees. We had explicitly told her we couldn't maintain such burdens, especially since we were trying to stabilize our own lives after the pandemic, but she had become a different person. In her fevered state, she grew angry, her voice rising until the monitors beeped in protest, spitting out an array of frantic notes, and as they moved to stabilize her, I felt something shift in the air. We lost her a day later, and with her went those ominous plans like a dark storm cloud hovering over us. When we gathered with the family days later to read the will, her attorney handed over a neatly typed paper outlining her loving gifts. I felt the blood drain from my face as I scanned the page, but as I looked around the room, none of my in-laws seemed to flinch. Their expressions were almost gleeful, like they were satisfied with her eccentric logic. I turned to my husband, gauging his reaction, but he was silent, a muscle twitching at his jaw. That's when I felt my gut twist. Did they know something I didn't? I brushed it off, thinking that maybe this was her outrageous way of keeping us tied to her legacy. Yet, as the days passed, keeping up with anonymous letter after letter from the timeshare companies demanding payment, I began to feel something lurking in the shadows. The first sign I noticed was at our doorstep, a heavy package wrapped in a dark, coated paper with no return address. I opened it to find an ominous leather binder embossed with an insignia I didn't recognize, a serpent intertwining with a skull, each letter ominously fading into the worn edges. Inside, an old photograph showed timeshares with figures that looked hauntingly familiar. My heart raced as I flipped through, affirmation of Diane's haunting grip still latching onto us, grinning maliciously through the ages. I felt the chill of unseen eyes, and it escalated to a weekly affliction. Every Monday, more packages arrived, and with them, an ever-deepening dread. They held strange notes, requests that revealed an unsettling trend. Each note dished out threats about some familial pact that had gone unfulfilled, with instructions no one could decipher. It claimed that we would own not only the timeshares, but also their dark histories, leading us to confront shattered memories of the past I didn't know I was connected to. My husband became a shell of who he was, slowly deteriorating under the pressure of family whispers, and it broke my heart to watch as he no longer found solace in our home. We fought more, and nights devolved into silence as we each lay awake, haunted. Then, one night while unpacking a new round of letters, I stumbled upon something even darker, a crudely drawn map with arrows leading to the bases of the timeshare properties, each one marked with an X. As I studied it, the atmosphere in the room thickened, and I could hear my husband yelling at something invisible. He was in a fit, begging for whatever dark presence to leave us alone as he drew back into that despondent spiral. I watched in horror as the glow around him dimmed. Suddenly, he wasn't himself anymore. The land where we thought we would craft memories had begun to consume us, revealing secrets that had long lingered in the shadows. We tried cutting ties, but the letters became more menacing, each threatening paragraph ushering in a new realm of despair. Then came the nightmares. They were vivid, bringing echoes of Diane standing at the edge of a storm-lashed beach, her laughter twisted and echoing as though she enjoyed watching us writhe in agony, and each night, it felt like we were being pulled into an abyss where neither of us could escape. My husband grew distant, wrapped in unfathomable darkness until one evening I woke up to find him gone. Panic set in as I searched everywhere, only to find the door ajar, leading to the open night air where the moon hung heavy. It was at that moment I realized he had become entrapped in the very thing Diane had left us, a cursed possession disguised as a gift. I ran toward the beach as fear surged through me, and at the water's edge, I caught sight of him standing there, entranced by something in the distance. I screamed, but the waves drowned me out, and by the time I reached him, his eyes were glazed over, filled with a stirring malice that raised my hair and froze my breath. It wasn't him anymore, it was something sinister wearing his skin as the ground trembled beneath me. I stumbled back, realizing that Diane's gift was more than financial, it was an unholy legacy. Now, every time a package arrives, every whisper from our family or sighting at our doorstep sends chills washing over me. I can't tell what's real anymore, and as the letters demand my husband's soul, I feel the tide rise, cleaving our fates, one letter at a time. So here I am, terrified and alone, begging for someone to believe me, drowning in the legacy she intended for us, an inheritance of which we never asked. But now it feels like we've entered an irrevocable deal with the dead, and each passing day, I fear I will wake up at the water's edge and find him gone forever, consumed by the darkness, forever tangled in the serpent's embrace.